Our journey begins with a colourful festival in the town square, decorated with flags and lights. The inhabitants crowded around the square, watching in fascination the performance of a lively dancer. The colourful festival was watched with longing in her eyes, and the protagonist, Armonia, hidden from prying eyes in a tall tree and covered with a dark cloak. Amidst the rumble of fireworks, the girl was called out by a creature with the speaking name of Fairy. It wasn't hard for her to find Armonia, for as we can understand, she exudes a sweet scent that probably only fairy-like creatures can smell. The creature decides to ask if Armonia misses human society, since she comes to this place to observe every celebration, to which the girl, holding her little friend with a smile, waves off the usual curiosity. Armonia has probably never been to a festival, wanting to know what people do during this carefree time. However, the fun didn't last long. Armonia receives an order from her little friend, the Prime Minister, that from the new year there will be a mass suppression of monsters, and the place of the raid announced their home, the Forest Voltar. Annoyed Armonia, not knowing what to do, hastily decides to go back to the forest. In a rush, we learn that Armonia was born into the Duke of Felborn's family. We are shown a day from her memories when she brought a gift, a shimmering, faceted stone from an unknown friend in the forest, and happily showed it to her father. The frightened father realizes that there can be no friends in the dark forest, where at every turn an unknown creature can appear. And at that moment, the one she called her friend comes out of the thicket after little Armonie, terrifying everyone around her. The girl's family, panicking, is about to give an evacuation order because of the attack of the monster mob that came out. But surprisingly, Armonie, not at all afraid of the creature that looks like a troll, ran straight into its clutches under the frightened screams of her parents. Glad to see her again, the girl climbs onto the troll's shoulder, laughingly jerking it by its large, outstretched ear. The monsters didn't seem to want to harm her at all. They were just looking for Armonia to enjoy time together again. Some time later, after several such incidents, a council of the heads of influential families was assembled. All as one told the confused father of Armonia that because of his daughter alone, there was no peace for anyone in the duchy, and therefore it was necessary to get rid of the girl for the good of all the people. Little Armonia heard this conversation. The cruel words that she was the cause of all the trouble and impending danger made the girl run away to her most peaceful place, the forest. In tears, she hid from the terrible world that was supposed to protect her. Armonia's cries are answered by her familiar troll, who is concerned about her condition. Stuttering with tears, the girl tells her friend about her misfortune. And always the forest and its inhabitants accepted her in every way. She always felt she was welcome there, and so she made the decision to hide in the forest. 17 years have passed since that day, during which she and the monsters have never left the forest. Armonia, having returned to the place where she has always been cared for and worried about, realizes that she must protect her ancestral home, the Volta Forest, from harm at all costs. The girl decides that if people are so sure of their victory, they can't be changed so easily, so she should talk to their head. It was dangerous, because the outcome of such actions is unknown to anyone. And yet, it is better to do something than to do nothing, and lose the most precious thing that exists on this earth for Armonia, knowing that people need her. The girl is determined to make the trek, taking 2 little companions, Fairy and Lime, a golden, shapeless creature, as her partners. Lastly, the troll hands Armonie an amulet linked to a powerful being called Karis. She instructs the girl to break this pendant in case of danger. The girl embarks on a dangerous journey, instructing the troll to take care of the family in her absence. And so, for the first time in 17 years, Armonia leaves her home nest in hopes of saving her land from imminent doom. Armonia, following her plan, makes her way to a village she already knows from afar. However, this is where the plan ends. The girl hurriedly ponders what to do next. The impatient companions, tired of hiding, ask Armonia now and then whether they have arrived at the place. The girl asks them to be patient, to which they obediently agree, and she promises them to try to hurry up. Walking through the settlement, the girl discovers something she couldn't have spotted from afar. You can buy anything you want here. From everywhere, you could hear the luring speeches of sellers announcing low prices for their goods. And then the girl remembers that in the world of people, money is necessary for many things. Armonia dutifully began scouring her hiking bag for something she could sell. She would certainly need the money while she was among the humans. But what would the merchants be interested in? All of the girl's belongings were either necessary or of little value. But lo and behold, she finds a translucent stone that resembles a starry sky, just like a jewel. Perhaps it can be sold for a bargain. Then the travelling companions offer their ideas of dubious earnings as well. Ferry could steal money from someone, and Lime could eat that person so as not to leave evidence. But the girl dissuades her friends from this adventure. In the course of this amusing conversation, Armonia notices people crowded around a booth with advertisements. She decides to go over and find out what the Gawkers are so interested in. It was impossible to get through the crowd to the board, but the heated discussions conveyed all the rumours themselves. People were talking about the upcoming raid on the forest and the fact that the monsters living there were ruled by a girl with hair the colour of water. Of course, they were talking about Armonia. During the exchange of rumours, one of the Gawkers sneers that it is possible to speak to monsters in human language because they are completely inconsiderate. This conversation played on the delicate strings of Armonia's soul, and she decides to leave this place, continuing her journey. Along the way, she reflected on the fact that every person in her path was convinced that monsters were unreasonable and incapable of solving anything peacefully. However, those who refused to make contact and wanted to start a war were not forest creatures at all, but humans intent on destroying Armonia's ancestral home. Now, who is worthy to bear the title of monster? Drowning in her thoughts, the girl nervously searched for a place to sell the gem. Her gaze stopped at just the right shop. At the very threshold, she was greeted by the ringing of the doorbell and a neatly dressed man inquiring what the lady who entered was looking for. Armonia declares that she has goods for sale. Upon examining it, the merchant could not believe his eyes. The surprise on the man's face changed to excited joy. He asked what price the girl wanted for the stone. Armonia realizes that the thing is really valuable, so she decides to try bargaining. But the attempt fails at the very first sentence, where the girl urges the merchant to guess how much money she has. What a ridiculous thing to say. It became immediately clear that the bargaining should be done in a different way, when the merchant froze in bewilderment. The lack of communication with people played a cruel trick on the girl. Laughter was heard at the front door. The girl's awkwardness seemed to have been caught by another man who had just entered the shop in the midst of a bad bargain. The man who entered removed his hood, revealing his charming countenance. He said that this really wasn't the best way to bargain. The stranger obviously knew more about this sort of thing. In addition, he pointed out that the stone that Armonia brought wasn't a jewel at all. It turned out to be a magic stone that was used to summon monsters. The girl recalls that people do call the mineral that. However, considering that she saw it everywhere in the forest, it is unlikely that it is used for the designated purpose. Without shyness, the stranger takes the valuable find, and examining it from all sides, remarks that this is the first time he has seen such a pure magical stone. But Armonia didn't care what the stone meant to people. She had to get the money for it, and leave in a hurry, for time was short. She asked the merchant to put a price on the mineral, but the stranger overtakes her and overwhelms her with an offer to buy him for any price she wants. All that's left is to name it. The young man persisted in asking the girl about the price for her goods. Armonia, being completely inexperienced, decides to listen to the stranger's offer, wondering how much he will pay. The man offers 200,000 gold pieces without hesitation. The merchant immediately declares that this is too low a price for such a thing, offering 250,000 on his part. So a heated haggle broke out between the merchant and the young man. Each raised the price until the man reached a number of more than 500,000 gold pieces, which was clearly beyond the seller's means. However, the young man's generous offer was rejected by Armonia, who abruptly ended the argument. Since she had decided to sell the stone to her mustachioed uncle, she would do so, and while the winning bidder went to get the money, the girl came under the young man's oppressive gaze. Was he angry with her for not giving up her value to him? After a few seconds of tense silence, the stranger decides to ask where Armonia found such a rare stone, to which he receives a completely unexpected answer: near the house. It is unlikely that he expected such a simple answer from her, because otherwise the price for the stone would be much lower. But the impending interrogation was interrupted by a happy merchant who returned with sacks full of gold coins. The girl hurriedly thanked her uncle and, taking her profit, set off. The young man, left with only an understatement, stared at the girl in the girl's wake. He couldn't even guess where Armonia lived, since she was able to find such a rare, pure mineral. Something this girl was definitely hiding from him. After a while, Armonia arrived at an inn with the interesting name of Monster Haven. Her travelling companions could no longer hide, complaining about the lack of air and fatigue. Armonia is greeted at the entrance by a friendly girl, who immediately starts asking the new guest what she wants. R, shyly covering her face with her hood, replies that she would like to stay alone for 3 days at the inn. The night's lodging cost 7 silver coins. While the girl at the counter was handing out the key and change, Armonia decided to ask if the choice of the inn's name was due to the fact that monsters would find shelter here as well. The girl at the counter looked at Armonia in surprise, contemplating what to say to her guest. She tried to reassure her that it wasn't true at all. As it turned out, lodge meant place of death. Monster hunters often stayed in this lodge, which, like its victims, looked terrifying. Besides, as the girl added, not-so-distant monsters didn't belong here. Attempts to reassure Armonia failed. It was not an explanation that would satisfy her at all. The frightened traveller hurried to her room, hearing the floor and lodging number thrown back at her. As soon as Armonia entered the room, her travelling companions burst out in joy. Looking around the room, they were quite pleased with the choice. Really not a bad place to stay for 3 days. But Armonia was not at all as pleased as her friends. In her feelings, she slowly sank to the floor, leaning her back against the closed door, and quietly mouthed an apology. Her friends were puzzled as to what could have prompted her to apologise for something they had no idea about. Armonia grieved at the unflattering words her friends had to hear. Though they were used to it, she wished with all her heart that it were no longer commonplace. It was time for the next step. The girl needed to find out who was in charge of the planned attack on the forest. Slightly staggering from fatigue, she got to her feet again and declared that she would soon return to her friends as she studied the announcement she had seen earlier. Her companions wanted to go with her, but she insisted that they wait for her in her room. In return, she promised to return within the hour and buy them a treat on the way back in the form of fruit, which, though it was human food, would surely please her friends. After picking up some bulk peaches along the way, similar to the ones that usually grew in the forest, Armonia began to look for the stand she had seen earlier in the afternoon. Walking a little way down the empty street, the girl spotted the very same ad and began to study it. Based on the order, the operation began to recruit fighters who were willing to take responsibility and pass the aptitude test. The warriors will receive a daily reward and will be entitled to keep the trophies of blood and horns of monsters, which was a monstrous condition. And who would agree to such a venture? The announcement was signed by the head of the Imperial Monster Extermination Committee, Chancellor Haider. This is probably the man responsible for all the mayhem. The girl makes a decision to go to the capital to meet him. Armonia was furious with anger. In a fit of anger at the brazen daredevil, she crumpled the bag of peaches slightly, causing one of the fruits to accidentally fall out and roll backwards. But the girl's malicious musings were stopped by the familiar voice of the man behind, who picked up the fallen fruit, asking in passing if Armonia was interested in the operation. The girl, nervous, turned around and saw again in front of her the same insolent and persistent young man from the jewellery store. The young man, approaching and returning the peach to its place, began to interrogate the girl as to what ability she possessed, since she was so interested in studying the advertisement. He did it with special zeal, leaning toward the girl from the height of his stature. Armonia excused herself, saying that she had no desire to participate in such an outing. Moreover, she didn't understand why people wouldn't just leave the monsters alone. The man truly believes that this is an evil that should not exist in our world, and he thinks so for a reason. We are transported to his memories, where, as a child, he watches the bloody action of the monster. These are the ones who bring only suffering, and so must be destroyed. The girl wondered why such thoughts would be in his head. The man only added that he would be glad to destroy all these creatures for the outing. The angry Armonia, no longer willing to tolerate these cruel words, threw a peach at the man's chest, calling him by the ridiculous insult, "troll booger." The juicy fruit crumpled in an instant and sprinkled the young man's robe with sweet juice, leaving a visible mark. When the crown prince talks about what he likes, when communicating, he can be more open with... Before the young man knew it, the girl was gone. And what kind of insults are these ethereal? The man plunged into thought. It was clear from the full bag of peaches that the girl was obviously not travelling alone. In addition, she had no lust for profit, and occasionally got into awkward conversations with people. However, her habit of familiarity gave away the blood of an aristocratic family. The young man was curious about everything. Getting rid of the sticky peach juice with a handkerchief, he could find no excuse for the one protecting monsters in the very epicenter of hostility, the village of Waldbrunn. He intended to learn as much about her as he could. In her haste, Armonia burst into the room. When questioned by her worried companions, the girl began describing the brash man as a mixture of troll booger and dirt from an orc's fingernail, with familiar insults. The indignant girl dropped the ripe fruit on the bed and sat down herself, not even wanting to remember today's skirmish. Putting to bed, the girl decides that it makes no sense to stay in the lodge for 3 days. So the next day they will buy everything they need and go to the capital. Reasoning, the girl gradually sinks into the kingdom of Morpheus. Ferry, doubting that this kind of interaction between R and humans is a good idea, covers the girl with a blanket and thanks her for today's hard day. The next day, the friends, as agreed, bought everything they needed for the long journey, and on the tip of the shopkeeper, went to a place where they could rent a carriage for a few days. The girl was worried because she had not yet had to rent a carriage on her own. As it turned out, her fears were not accidental. When we arrived at the right place, it turned out that all the carriages had been bought by some powerful man, and it was a week's journey to the next place where you could rent a carriage. The confused girl Armonie didn't even notice the looming figure in her path and collided with it. The familiar voice had no sooner uttered an apology than they both recognized each other. It was again the brash man from the shop who seemed to follow Armonia everywhere. The irritation on the man's face was clear as he colourfully described the very juicy peach mercilessly thrown into his expensive robe that had to be discarded. Those clothes were worth twice as much as the magic stone Armonie had sold, and the young man insisted on making amends in money or something else. He wouldn't leave the girl for nothing, and while annoyed by such a misfortune, Armonia was already imagining how diligently she would sell such magic stones, scraping together a refund for the value of the ruined item at the mention of other means of payback. She remembered something that could get her out of her unpleasant situation. It was a proven method that the Night Witch had told her about. There was nothing left to do but use it. Armonia, abruptly recoiling from the man and shrieking across the square, attracting people's attention, began to accuse the young man of molestation and indecent proposals, raising her voice and emphasizing it. The dumbfounded man, who had not expected such shenanigans, froze, staring at the young actress. The girl's drama was only getting more heated. Confused, the young man tried to reassure Armonia, who had already gotten the hang of it, by telling her that he might be in trouble if she continued to behave like this. But the girl was unstoppable. The girl's screams were stopped by the man's strong grip on her arm as he tried to stop Armonia's screams. A passerby in the crowd decided to help the girl who was so desperately crying for help. The saviour let Armonia know that it was time to leave, and he led the young man, who had completely lost touch with what was happening, to the proceedings. And now Armonia was leaving with a smug grin. The young man tried to justify himself that this was not at all the situation everyone might have thought it was. And the girl, not at all regretting her prank, went on her way. As they were moving away from the scene, Armonia heard from afar what she thought was the name Khan, belonging to the young man. A strange name for a man indeed. It takes a long time for the already desperate guy to prove that he is not guilty of anything. Suddenly we learn that this young man is the one who is organising the offensive, Chancellor Haider. He was a rather important man, so it was necessary to confirm his identity to the pesky saviour of Armonia. Showing the Emperor's signed order, annoyed by his omission, Haider puts everything in its place. It was decided to forget the awkward situation, for the man had a bigger task, to catch Armonia again. In that crowd was a girl who works at the carriage rental place. She politely inquired what the nimble lady had done wrong. Haider replied that she had ruined a very expensive item for him and now had to pay for it. Still, there was something the girl at the rental counter could help the young man with. She told him that Armonia had inquired about carriages to the capital and was probably on her way to the village of Hov, where she could take a carriage to her desired destination. A few days later, we are shown Armonia, haggard from exhaustion. She had travelled a long way with her friends, but it was still 3 whole days to go to the capital. But is the goal worth it? Wouldn't they be turned around, just as they were in the last village, because there were no carriages left? Tired from such a long journey, and from thinking, Armonia takes a seat right in the middle of the road, complaining of heavy legs that are no longer able to keep moving. Tension from fatigue was building up in everyone, and now a furious ferry was cursing the man who had bought up all the carriages, that now they had to suffer so much because of him. There's nothing to do. Most of the way has already been travelled, so we'll have to put the rest of our strength into the final push. The tired companions were about to go back to the village of Hov, but there was a clatter of horses' hooves. It seems that these are the very hated carriages from the village of Waldbrunn. Armonia asks her friends to hide for a while the transports pass by, so they won't be spotted by people and get sandy. While waiting for the time to climb out, Armonia notices that the sounds don't sound like a normal ride, but as if horses were being driven. There was a terrible and familiar roar. It was an enraged wyvern attacking the departing carriages. Armonia knew for a fact that wyverns didn't just attack humans. And what was she doing here so far from home? Meanwhile, the attack on the carriages continued. The girl heard the wyvern trying to say something through the shouts and rumbling. A swarm of creatures swooped down and threw the carriages from the heights, terrifying all who travelled inside. The people fought back desperately with swords. Armonia, hiding quite close to the beating, was finally able to hear the wyvern's demand. Those scoundrels had stolen her child, and now the mother wanted him back by all means. It could only mean that there was a stolen child in one of the carriages right now. Armonia decides to take the dangerous step of waving off her friend's entreaties to leave it on the shoulders of the guilty. She was determined to find the child and return it to its mother. But she didn't want it for the humans at all. She wanted it for the family reunion. She knew what the disturbed wyvern was feeling right now, because she valued her family as well. Armonia adjusts her hood and sets off on a dangerous sortie. The child must be found before the situation gets worse. Suddenly, the girl collides shoulder to shoulder with one of the warriors. He roughly pushes her away with force that the girl falls to the ground, shouting that she interferes with the action. What horrible creatures humans are after all. But this fall played into Armonia's hands. Suddenly, a glow from the carriage drew her attention to what she was looking for. A stolen egg. There can be no mistake. Armonia had seen a similar egg before. Now it must be returned soon, so that the wyvern would calm down. But as he tried to lift the egg, it collapsed heavily from the carriage to the ground. How could the monsters lift it so easily if it was so heavy? The girl couldn't lift it by herself. Looking around the pack of attacking wyverns, Armonia discerned the largest dragon with a deep scar over his eye. Well, definitely the leader. The girl began to attract the attention of the large lizard, shouting and waving her arms. The dragon heard the girl, marvelling at her ability to speak the same language as him. The lizard descended toward the girl, raising road dust into the air with its massive wings. The girl boldly called his name and said she knew where his child was. Armonia pointed to the egg lying beside the carriage, which she had only just managed to pull out. No need to worry now. The wyvern's eyes glistened with happiness. There were no words of gratitude, so he simply lowered his head to the girl, bowing slightly. This is the end of the conflict, but the lizard intends to retaliate further, as his tense wings made clear, ready to fight again. But the men would be doomed to perish if the fighting continued. The carriages would not reach the village, and then the already exhausted girl would be doomed to an even longer journey to the capital on foot. Armonia grabs the already taking off wyvern by its massive paw and asks it to stop. She didn't side with those dastardly humans. Not at all. She can't take much longer without transportation, and she needs to get to the capital and meet with the Chancellor. The lizard, after listening to the girl, could not refuse her request. As we learn from his words, he recalled the day he had seen her as a child, taken in by creatures from the Voltar forest. Armonia was no longer just a unique person who understood monsters and exuded a sweet odor. She was one of those creatures, and the lizard saw her for the first time since that day, barely recognizing her as the child she was. So changed was Armonia. The touching moment was interrupted by the cries of warriors ready for battle, running toward the leader of the pack of wyverns. The feeling of kinship and gratitude overcame the anger, and the lizard was ready to retreat. With a wild roar, the dragon soared into the sky, raising the wind with its wings. These bandits were lucky today. The pack began to move away, leaving the men stunned and ready to continue the fight to the last man. In the rising dust, R managed to escape, and Ferry and Lime, who were unable to find a place to stand, ran at their friend in tears, showing their excitement. Again, a familiar voice came from the roadway. By coincidence, Chancellor Haider was in one of those carriages. He was trying to take charge of the situation and rally the men before the wyverns returned. And so, everyone was on the road again. The time was nearing deep night, and Armonia suggested to her companions that they spend the night in a cozy clearing in the forest under the night sky. Everyone was hungry, but since there were only a few slices of dried meat left, and there were no natural gifts nearby, it was decided to build a fire and divide the food among the three of us. Thus passed the cozy night. A few days later, we see an exhausted Armonie leaning on a thick stick picked up in the woods. She had finally arrived with Ferry and Lime in the village of Hov. It was necessary to rest, find lodging for the night, and rent a carriage to the capital. Her strength was almost gone, and the hardships were only increasing. The annoying young man waiting at the entrance was no exception. Haider, teasing the exhausted Armonie about her being a full day late by his reckoning, reminded her of her still unpaid debt. The girl didn't even have the energy to confront the young man, but his voice alone disgusted her indescribably. The exhausted girl moved forward with all her might, studiously ignoring Haider's words. The Chancellor didn't know if the girl really didn't know him, or if she was just pretending. When he tried to ask her about it, he raised his hand, which the girl took as an attempt to grab her. She must not let that happen, for she had no strength to break free. With a sharp jerk, Armonia gifted Haider with a stick blow to the stomach. The time gained was a real gift. We must run quickly. Gathering the rest of her strength, the girl rushed forward, hurling the familiar, ridiculous insults, and leaving the young man with terrible pain and increasing incomprehension each time. Armonia had no memory of getting the key to the room and reaching it. In a flurry of fear of being caught, everything was a blur. But the important thing was that they had succeeded. Ferry and Lime were overwhelmed with emotion. How dare this man persecute their dear R? But the tired girl, not reaching the bed, but only laying her head on it, crouched on the floor, thinking about how not to cross paths with this young man again. Armonia had had absolutely no luck since she was a child. She didn't often come across magic stones, and the trees she climbed were sure to have beehives on them. But even in such situations, she found support in her forest friends. But not in the circumstances in which she found herself again and again. These circumstances were the repeated encounters with Chancellor Haider. As soon as she left her room to go into town to shop, she ran into him. The young man chuckled that such frequent encounters were definitely predestined by fate. The girl pulled her hood over her face helplessly, not knowing how to disengage now. Armonia discovers that the man who bought up all the carriages in Waldbrunn was this very arrogant young man. His only excuse was that he didn't know he would need more vehicles. At last there is a moment when the young man can talk to the girl, but reminding her casually of the pain from the blow to her stomach only makes her angrier. Armonia, already resigned to the suffering ahead, decided that she would walk the rest of the way. It was better than negotiating with a smug guy. The man grew sad as he watched the disregard for himself. However, he did not give up trying to keep the conversation going. He knew for sure that the girl was going to the capital, so he decided to offer her to go with him. That look, like that of a night witch seducing her prey, sent shivers down Armonia's spine. There was little chance of reaching the capital on her own, since she'd barely crawled to the neighbouring village. But the traveller could not so easily trust a man who would raid her home forest with evil intentions. He would have no trouble capturing Ferry and Lime and putting them in one of the ransomed carriages, just as he had the stolen wyvern child. She had no right to be with those with the exact opposite agenda. With a strain in her voice, Armonia refuses the offer. Haider decides to go for a stratagem. Yes, the girl could rent a carriage in the next village as well, but not if someone would buy them out again, which the man was about to do, informing Armonia with a smirk about it. The girl had less and less reason to refuse. She was more and more sorry that she had stopped the wyvern, for her good heart had allowed the one who was trying to blackmail her to reach the village in one piece. In an attempt to make conversation again, Haider began to talk about the attack on the road and the dead. But the girl turned and headed away with a one-word reply. Haider could not understand why the girl was so indifferent to people. But he didn't stop there, saying that one of the knights had spotted a girl on the road with a wyvern dressed exactly like Armonia. How many travellers would be seen in the same garb on the road to the village she was heading for? There were too many coincidences here. And why hadn't the lizard attacked her? It was very much like the day the Empire had been alarmed by a long-ago monster raid. The truth was on Haider's side, though he was only guessing about it. Placing a hand on the girl's shoulder and stopping her, he waited for a response. Armonia was going to fall through the ground. All that troubled her were the growing suspicions. However, the man was only interested in how she had managed to chase the wyverns away, for almost no daredevils had information about monsters that could not be caught. The man, already as if mocking, asked Armonia if she had ever met a girl in a brown robe. The mockery paid off, and the traveller blurted out that she had no intention of meeting her. Hoping that was all, she realised that her cloak would no longer be a disguise, but an identifying mark. She had to change it, get some food, and get back on the road. Turning around, the girl wandered toward the clothing store she'd spotted earlier. The man followed her, pestering her with questions about her plans. The girl mumbled about the robe, but Haider's pursuit angered her. Haider, as if making excuses on the fly, said he needed a new robe, and the old one, though new, bored him. The girl could not tolerate such arrogance. Well, if he's going to throw it away, let him do it now. The girl pointed her finger insistently in front of her. Haider obediently decided to give in and dropped the robe in front of the girl on the ground. He had already said goodbye to her. The plan had worked. Armonia's cunning hands had gotten hold of a good robe, and now she didn't need to get a new cape. It was a trick the man had never expected. But not missing an opportunity, Haider decided to remind himself of the debt of 1,000,000 gold coins, to which the cost of the cape was now added, even though it had been discarded. The girl couldn't get her head around the man's stinginess. If he had enough money to buy up all the carriages, why was he so thrifty with the discarded things? But that wasn't the point at all. Rather, it was a reciprocal ploy, so that the girl would have no chance to get away with it. Since the man was well aware that Armonia could not return such a large sum, he offered another way to pay. She just needed to listen to him. The man knew that Armonia was on her way to the capital and offered her a job with him. Her task was simple: tell him everything she knew about the monsters. But the girl took this offer as a betrayal of her friends. She could not sell information about her friends to cruel people for any money, so Armonia dismissed it, saying that she did not want to do it, and she did not know anything. Haider didn't give up. Since the first offer was rejected, he suggested that the girl just help avoid encounters with monsters, just like with wyverns. As we can understand, the man had guessed everything long ago. The girl was indignant that she had been led around by the nose all this time, although she was not at all able to hide her emotions. The job seemed easy, and the girl agreed, but with two conditions: she would ride in a private carriage, and the knights would not attack the monsters first. In case they did, she would go her own way. The man objected that the wyverns had attacked for no reason, and they had been forced to fight back. Then Armonia recalled the egg that had been in one of the carriages, for it was only because she had returned it that the people had been saved. Haider admitted that he had bought it from a monster hunter and saw nothing wrong with it. The disgust on the girl's face only grew stronger. This act was tantamount to buying a human child. It was surprising that the girl had to explain such simple things. But the man, after thinking about it, admitted his guilt. He had never had to put himself in the shoes of monsters, so he didn't think about it, but he promised to be more careful in the future. The girl was amazed. Perhaps this young man was not so stubborn, but she quickly gave up these thoughts, because people do not change so quickly. Moreover, until this moment, he had not even been visited by such bright thoughts. Haider, without waiting for Armonia's final answer, announced the contract. He warned the girl that it would take about a month to reach the capital by carriage. Soon they would be on their way, for the rainy season was about to begin in the village of Hov. The man couldn't help but admonish the girl. Since she worked for him now, he asked her to address him more politely, since no one else would allow herself to speak to him so informally, but her. Armonia only shrugged her shoulders. And the weather did indeed worsen. I could feel the damp wind swaying the branches of the trees, tearing off their leaves. There was no avoiding trouble in the forest at this hour. I wish Haider had trusted her. After a while, Armonia returned to her friend's lodge and recounted what had happened over the eating of ripe apples. The girl was wavering between this decision and the safety of her friends, for it was dangerous for them. But Fairy reassured the girl, saying that they would accept any decision she made. They cannot always avoid people, and if they meet someone strong, they will use the pendant given by the troll in the forest. Taking a seat on the girl's shoulder and nuzzling her cheek, the flying creature added that they need not worry about them. They would be happy if their dear Armonia was happy. Lime, supporting these words, also pressed himself against the girl as if hugging her. The girl quietly mouthed words of gratitude to her companions, and so the troop set off. The carriages rushed one after another along the sandy road, surrounded by riders. Armonia, though not expecting the rigours of a carriage ride, imagined riding on the ogre's shoulder, setting herself up for positivity. But suddenly her keen hearing picked up a foreign sound. Armonia immediately demanded that the carriage be stopped, referring to the footsteps she had heard. The girl jumped dashingly to the ground and clung to it, listening to every rustle and movement as if she were tracking someone. It was unclear who the footsteps belonged to, but one thing was certain. There were many creatures. Having completed her analysis, Armonia made a suggestion to go through the forest, for it would be safer that way. The knights were puzzled by this abrupt, prolonged stop, so they decided to find out what was wrong. But who would have thought that the information about the approaching monsters would excite the warriors so much? They didn't want to hear of a safe journey, for that would be a cowardly escape. They wanted revenge for all the damage the wyverns had done to them. Haider tried to reason with the agitated knights. They had no way of dealing with so many creatures, but they were ready to fight here and now, even without paying attention to their commander's words. Armonia stood in a stupor as she watched the fighting attitude of the squad. She couldn't get her head around such madness. What gives one the confidence of a predetermined victory without even knowing her enemy by sight? The girls' attempts to dissuade the knights from attacking were in vain. They stood their ground, not knowing who they were dealing with. Haider, trying not to show his concern, decided to remind the girl that when she had made her contract with him, Armonia had claimed that it would be no problem for her to dissuade the monsters from attacking humans. But that was impossible to fulfill if the monsters had to defend themselves against an out-of-control squad. The girl gave an ultimatum that either the man would bring the men to their senses, or they would have to face death directly. That statement staggered Haider. He had absolutely no desire to encounter any monsters before coming to the capital. One of the knights called out to Armonia. His confidence was beaming that he wasn't afraid of such dozens of monsters. The warrior was confident in the squad's strength. That could only be the case if it was dozens of monsters that were approaching, but not the hundreds or thousands that were already behind him, snarling furiously. It was a troop of ogres, the monsters that Armonia feared most of all. Anthropomorphic creatures with red, scaly skin, powerful limbs and chilling eyes were ready to attack the overconfident knights. The frightened squad began to scramble for weapons. Haider stood frozen in place, horrified at the increasing bloodthirsty creatures. He was brought back to reality by Armonia urging him to leave the knights and go. Haider couldn't believe the girl was willing to leave everyone behind and flee. But could she control these hot-headed men? They didn't listen to Armonia, even though she warned them of the danger. Their primary job was to protect the commander. But Haider couldn't just walk away like that. We see his horrible memories from his childhood, when before his eyes many people were torn apart by bloodthirsty monsters. The images that came to mind brought back the emotions he had experienced then. The man clutched his head in panic, trembling and begging Armonia to save his people, for he could bear no more senseless sacrifices. It was as if he had gone mad, desperately trying to close himself off from the horror that was happening. The girl, looking at the helplessly trembling man who could barely utter a word, didn't know what to do. She had made a promise and even signed a contract, so she couldn't just turn a blind eye to what was happening. Turning back to the squad, she realized that their confidence had instantly evaporated. The warriors trembled in front of the huge creatures, not having thought before that there would be so many of them. Even for a girl who knew the language of monsters, it could be dangerous, but the decision had already been made. Armonia gave orders for the knights to pick up Haider and leave as soon as possible along the same trail that would lead them to the village, and leave the troop of anthropomorphic reptiles to it. The men hastily assembled, and taking Haider, who was unmindful of his fear, drove the carriages away. The monsters were about to give chase, but the fragile Armonia blocked their path. She took off her hood and greeted the ogres. The ogres were amazed to hear their language from a human. Moreover, she had monster companions with her, which prevented the reptiles from getting close to the girl. Armonia asked the monsters to retreat. However, those had heard from somewhere that these knights were members of the suppression squad. If they retreated now, they would definitely die in the future. The girl assured him that she was travelling with this group to the capital to settle the situation. She too needed to be sure that the raid would not happen, for the safety of her home, the forest of Voltar, was at stake, and this procession would lead her straight to her goal. The very child of the Voltar forest, in which the monsters had harboured an unusual human child. The ogres had heard of her. Armonia's odour, pleasant to the monsters, was proof of her good intentions. But the reptiles couldn't back down. It was not easy to cool their fervour, and it was not rational to submit to the girl's request. It was necessary to make an equal sacrifice, so that they would leave the suppression squad alone. Be that as it may, Armonia wasn't going to make another contract. Then she decided that the best thing to do was to give the monsters a tip about the location of the Hov village the warriors were leaving from. They had provided the carriages to help the squad, and were therefore involved in the whole action. After some thought, the lizards trusted the girl. The village was good payback. This tip was the price for the knights' foolish stubbornness, the burden of which was also to be borne by themselves. The leader of the ogres directed his subordinates to follow the girl's instructions, but to her surprise, he instructed her to deal with the head of the offensive. Even such a terrifying creature did not want a war between monsters and humans. As the lizards turned toward the village, Armonia decided to ask them one last time where they had gotten the rumour of the raid. There were few monsters who would know about it, much less report it. Judging from the response, it was a creature in a dark cloak, speaking the language of monsters like Armonia. Although the silhouette was very similar to that of a human, that unknown person was not a member of that species. The leader of the ogres was finished. After bidding farewell to the Voltar forest, he led his troop toward the village. The girl collapsed to the ground with helplessness. Holding her head, she mumbled how tired she was of wasting her strength. Even though the blame lay on the shoulders of the short-sighted warriors, the burden for all possible sacrifices seemed to fall on the fragile girl's shoulders. Humans have a talent for quick escape, but when Armonia gave the order to flee, she didn't mean to take all the carriages away. We had to set out on foot. The girl heard familiar voices and headed towards them, but on arrival the atmosphere was not at all friendly. Haider persistently hinted that the squad should not leave the girl in distress, so they should go in search of her. But one of the knights who had been negotiating with the commander, remembering the panic at the appearance of the lizards, insisted on continuing on their way. The warriors saw no fault in the loss that had occurred. Moreover, they did not consider it important to take care of their saviour in return, again making an irresponsible decision. Armonia stood by the nearest tree, watching in amazement. The commander himself is so concerned for her safety, for no reason, she thought. The girl burst into the fray with a question about what was going on. She had stirred up everyone with her appearance, raising a number of questions, because few people could escape unharmed from the clutches of such dangerous monsters. Armonia limited herself to a short answer. It was her secret. It was enough for Haider to see that the girl was alive, but the very combat guy wanted answers. The knight didn't understand why the girl who was working alongside them couldn't share information that could save their lives in the future and help kill these bloodthirsty creatures. Armonia's patience was wearing thin. She blurted out that she was not like them, and even if she knew something, she would never share it with them. The simple truth that a couple of swings of the sword was not enough to destroy such creatures was beyond the reach of the warriors, and even with the necessary information, it was unlikely that they would have been able to kill the monsters. The knight's hot ardor burst out when the girl began to reprimand him so rudely in public. He wasn't able to control his emotions, and in an instant he grabbed the girl by the collar, cutting off her access to oxygen. Haider's strong hand stopped the impending scuffle, pushing the rampaging knight away from the girl. Armonia, struggling to catch her breath, whether from fear or from the forced stoppage of breathing, found herself in her commander's safe hands. Such behavior was unacceptable to the man who sometime earlier had saved the lives of the men of the entire troop who had cowardly fled at the first opportunity. The Chancellor shamed the warrior for such shamelessness. Without her help, they would all have fallen into the clutches of the ogres long ago. The conflict was quickly resolved, and Haider, with a smile, cast a glance at the embarrassed girl, told her to take a seat beside the coachman, where it would be more comfortable for her to continue on her way. The troop set off once more. On the way, the girl recalled the cruel sayings of the knights, worrying that this conversation was definitely heard by her friends, who were in constant danger. But the sad musings were interrupted by Haider, who decided that now was as good a time as any to thank Armonia for her efforts, for without her, they would surely be lost. The girl brushed it off, covering herself by saying that she was merely fulfilling the terms of the contract. They had made a contract without even knowing each other's names. Haider asked what name their saviour had. The girl hesitated, hoping it wouldn't get her into trouble, and said her name. Haider also decided to inquire in passing about the purpose of Armonia's journey. She did not hesitate long, but confidently declared that she intended to meet Chancellor Haider to discuss something important with him. Then the girl asked in reply about the young man's name. She had heard people in the square call him Kande. The coachman was about to whisper to Armonia that he was the one she wished to see, but the young man interrupted him sharply, claiming that Kande was his real name. The girl proudly declared that as soon as she found the Chancellor in the capital, she would inform him to appear there, since he was so interested in what she was eager to talk to him about. And Haider, smiling furtively, replied that he would look forward to that day. The man seemed to take it as a kind of game that he would like to watch develop further. The journey was long, and the moon was already rising over the dense forest. There was still a long way to go, so it was decided to spend the night in the middle of the thicket. Haider was genuinely interested in Armonia's opinion, which surprised her very much. Taking the opportunity, the girl warned the commander that this time they were obliged to follow her instructions. Otherwise, the responsibility would be removed from her. Armony also set a number of other conditions. Do not go deep into the forest, do not touch unknown gifts of the forest, and do not attack baby monsters. Past experience had shown that there was no need to explain these conditions. The wayfarer concluded by adding what the knights needed to know. Such a high reckoning for such deeds that had been done before would be on their shoulders. It is a heavy burden, which they are unlikely to be able to bear. And since that was the case, it was better not to bother anyone else unnecessarily and trust her from now on. Haider didn't quite understand what kind of payback they were talking about, but he didn't bother the girl with unnecessary questions, promising to give the knights every last detail. Armonia had long been troubled by the talk of the raid, but she was pleased that at least the Chancellor was listening to her. Or perhaps he was just pretending to. It wasn't that important. The girl abruptly ended her instructions and went to rest, leaving Haider alone with his thoughts. She closed herself in the carriage, finally getting a chance to let her friends outside, who even seemed to be used to the compact transportation by now. Ferry and Lime were in high spirits, albeit angrily and passionately discussing what they were prepared to do to people who allowed themselves to talk down to their dear R. Armonia was glad the day ended quietly, though it seemed like an eternity had passed instead of 24 hours. Several days passed quietly, until one day the squad was disturbed by a chase. They were chased by angry orcs who were chasing the carriages as fast as they could. Armonia begged the coachman named Mabu to pick up speed, for at this rate they would be caught quickly. But unfortunately, that was the speed limit. Orcs were the monsters that the girl expected to meet the least because of their small numbers. Moreover, these creatures did not attack people first, but something made them take up arms and attack the carriages with full determination. There wasn't much further to the village where they could take shelter, but Haider's condition was gradually deteriorating. It was highly probable that the squad would fall into the clutches of the monsters again, and if the commander panicked again, it would be much harder. Armonia decides to enlist Ferry's help. She whispers to her to use her poison powder on the orcs to make them sleep until the carriages arrive in the village. The idea of helping people was not to the little fairy's liking, but she couldn't refuse the girl. The creature flew toward the fleeing orcs, spraying its magic pollen on them from above. Suddenly, the stupefied orcs would fall under the effects of the soporific powder, leaving the chase for a while. This was the squad's chance. The pollen should last about 10 hours, which was enough time to escape. People were puzzled as to what could have happened to make the monsters fall in an instant. It was a great teamwork between R and Ferry, but the joy did not last long. Haider doubted they could leave the orcs on the road so easily, for there was nothing to stop them from catching up again and harming not only the warriors, but the neighbouring village as well. Haider thought it would be far more expedient to finish them off at once. The suggestion made the girl shudder. Without a second's hesitation, the girl ordered the coachman to move on. If she delayed, the monsters she had sworn not to touch would die. The commander urged the girl to think better of it, to which Armonie rudely silenced him with a chilling glare and listened to her. According to the girl's legend, she heard footsteps again, so rather than delay and stay where she was, it was better to continue on to the village. She frightened the man with a repetition of the disaster that had nearly killed them, which put Haider in her place. To think that humans are so determined to fight that they are willing to finish off even creatures that cannot fight back. Armonia became more and more convinced that these vile creatures had no pity and could never be trusted. After a few hours, a strong wall with guards at the entrance showed up ahead. At last they had arrived. Armonia was dying of boredom. Haider was glad he had listened to the girl, and so they managed to reach the village safely, but her concern was evident the rest of the way. He thought he should let her rest while he filled out the list of arrivals as a pass. Curious Armonia, who did not know what to do to occupy herself, left the carriage and puzzled Haider by her appearance. She was curious to know the whole system of passage to the villages. The man decided that his condescension and openness might cheer the girl up. He kindly explained that the village of Parteo was the most important checkpoint before the capital, and that it was the place where arrivals were scrutinized. But you don't have to go through it if you have a special pass in the form of a wooden plaque, which you can only get if you have status or special status. This upset the girl. For having gotten such a pass, she would have just stolen the carriage and quietly escaped. Haider was interrupted by the alarming ringing of a bell. Armonia was puzzled as to what a few quick taps might mean, and then it came to the man that it was a warning of approaching monsters. The herd of orcs was catching up with the troop again, already posing a danger to the village as well. The people couldn't move in fear, for such a thing could easily wipe out an entire village. Haider panicked, remembering that the best solution was to kill the creatures while they were still asleep. The girl thought tensely, puzzled as to how the effects of Ferry's pollen could have worn off so quickly. It was necessary to talk to the monsters in person, but with so many eyes on them, it was extremely unreliable. Armonia caught a glimpse of the approaching herd, as one faintly murmured something about the humans' declaration of war, so they could not stand idly by. But the raid hadn't even begun. Was it that creature again, spreading rumours among the monsters and forcing them to gather armies? Only the humans were worse, not knowing anything for sure, but certain that the mere sounds of the orcs were a signal that the attack was imminent. Before the humans made trouble again, action had to be taken. Armonia ran toward the orcs, hoping to negotiate, but a worried Haider stopped her by the arm, unable to imagine how he could let the girl go alone to the monsters so easily. Armonia reminded herself of her promise. The man asked for at least a little thought and a plan. After all, orcs were treated as cannibals, to which Armonia cut off that there was no time for that at all. And while she would, like him, ponder, she would lose precious time and opportunity. The girl broke free of the man's grip and ran again, leaving him behind. Haider, watching the brave Armonia follow, wondered if anything would have changed on that bloody day that had panicked him, if he had done something about it. But the answer was not yet available to him. After all, Armonia had been the one who had rid the group of the ogres. She probably had some plan or method in mind now. Looking at the girl, he wondered if he should try to protect her now. Ferry got out of Armonia's hood, trying to stop the insane act. She kept telling her that orcs were slow-witted, which would make negotiations difficult, and Lime had mentioned that on top of everything else, they didn't tolerate humans. However, the girl was not to be dissuaded. She had already had experience with such a creature in her native forest, so why couldn't she reach this crowd now? Her friends were offended by R's concern for people's safety, because before she didn't care about them. The situation suggested that people were becoming more important to the girl than her family. But Armonia waved away the fact that she had made a promise to the commander. The orcs heard the girl's speech. They realized that she was in the mood for conversation, which the crowd also needed. The leader, like the crowd, spoke very incoherently, as if he were a foreigner who had just learned the basics of a new language. In addition, these creatures were very slow and not distinguished by a sharp mind, which got on the nerves of the girl, who tried to be patient. From the monster's words, it could be understood that they had heard about the impending attack, so they had gathered an army. But judging by the confused look of the humans, they were not in the mood to fight, and if it was true, the orcs would retreat. This was a chance to settle things peacefully. Armonia revealed that a raid on the Volta forest was indeed in preparation. It would be a profitable raid, both for the so-called safety of the people and for the large amount of resources that were there. Since the rumours about it turned out to be true, the orcs raised their weapons to protect their brothers. But the girl, raising her hands in front of her and trying to calm the excited crowd, assured them that she would prevent it. But her words were interrupted by an arrow that suddenly came from the direction of the village and hit the ground near the crowd. This roused the monsters, who decided that the humans were attacking them. Armonia's plans were threatened, and she turned to the attackers and shouted at them not to dare continue. The girl tried to justify the incident as an accident, pausing the orc by the arm, but he sharply pushed her away, ordering her to let go. The frail Armonia immediately flew off into a tree, landing on Lime, who jumped out of the bag just in time to save her from injury. And while the travellers' friends were reprimanding the orcs for taking out their anger on an innocent girl, Armonia was increasingly regretting her decision to protect the humans, because they were only making things worse. The girl didn't give up. She rose from the ground and, apologising for what had happened, offered to discuss all the monsters' homes where there wouldn't be so many people. Armonia assured the crowd that she wished to live in peace with them and was willing to tell them what she would do for them and for the future of the monsters as a whole. Fortunately, the orcs heard her. The desire to hear her overrode their sense of vengeance, so they greeted her as their first human guest. Orcs are unpretentious creatures. They began to try to find out what to offer the guest, and Armonia sighed with relief, realizing that the conflict had been resolved peacefully. But judging by the look on Haider's face, she did it in a way that made everyone nervous. As she went into the forest with the monsters, Armonia became a topic of discussion among the crowd of warriors who realized that the orcs were retreating. Haider didn't understand how the girl managed to persuade the monsters to leave. And wasn't it absurd that these creatures could negotiate? And yet what he was most concerned about was what would happen to his dear traveller. The man cared about her fate, for her death was not in his plans. When he heard the statement from one of the warriors about her demise, he grabbed him sharply by the collar and ordered him to bring the chief of the village immediately. Haider realized that he needed this unusual girl. Haider was escorted into a tall white building with columns and carved shutters on the windows, exactly the abode of a person of importance here. There he negotiated with an elegantly dressed man, who bowed his head to him obediently. The man was afraid to imagine why the Chancellor himself had come to his estate. Haider began the conversation with a kind of reproachful rebuke to someone who manages people not at all trained to remain calm in an emergency and listen to orders from higher-ups. And responsible for this incident was Baron Pecan, about whom there were not the most pleasant rumours. Haider insisted that the Baron must take responsibility for the consequences of the carelessness of his subordinates, for their recklessness had caused the kidnapping of a guide valuable to the suppression operation. Of course, what the Chancellor had in mind was for Pecan to gather an army to bring his precious guide back alive and unharmed at all costs. With indignation, the Baron slapped the table, spilling tea from the service and shouting that this was impossible. How valuable a guide must be, since there was no substitute for him and a large army would have to be assembled and put at risk for his sake. It would be much more profitable to find a new guide, which Pecan suggested as a compromise. But Haider stood his ground. He doubted very much that the new guide would meet his requirements. These requirements included a brilliant knowledge of monsters, as well as the ability to anticipate or track their movements. Such a person would help avoid wasted losses before arriving at the capital. There was no face on the Baron. He had never even seen a man in his life who could fit such a description. The selection criteria sounded to him like something fantastic and unattainable, but these were not idle whims that could be dispensed with. Haider, his voice growing sterner and more confident, stared at the dish of flour. The Chancellor spoke of how such a guide would not only keep their squad from being attacked prematurely. What's more, the girl must have abilities in addition to good knowledge. This was a unique opportunity to finally destroy these disgusting creatures without exception. Gathering a few cookies in his hand, he mercilessly squeezed them in his fist, turning them into crumbs as if to accompany his cruel story. Naturally, all of this is done for the benefit of the utopically peaceful empire and the people who live in it. The Baron insisted that the Chancellor think about possible losses now as well, but Haider would not even listen to him. Dropping his glove, which was stained with cookie residue, the young man mentioned that he had heard about the possibility of obtaining some forbidden substances in this village. But the price was not affordable for everyone, and there was an aristocrat in charge. Pecan tried to pretend he had absolutely no idea what the Chancellor was talking about, not accepting that he had been caught by the hand. It didn't clash with the greedy Baron's concern for the majority. Not all the information was announced. Haider put his hand on the trembling Baron's shoulder and, lowering his voice, warned him that he would not be fooled. There was a reason why that cunning fox was Chancellor. The manipulation bore instant fruit. Pecan, with his head down, agreed to rally the troops, but his last warning to the victorious Haider was that there was no guarantee that the warriors would survive, and there was no telling whether his indispensable guide would help him in such a dirty business. It was necessary to weigh the decision carefully. The Chancellor slammed the door shut. However, the Baron's words had not reached him in vain. The plan was indeed unreliable, and it was based only on the desperate idea of regaining Armonia. There was still time, for orcs had a habit of fattening people up. He called out to a stout young man with bright scarlet hair named Kuhn, who was waiting for him at the door. He was assigned to help the Chancellor, to which he agreed enthusiastically. At the same time, while there were heated discussions within the village walls, Armonia was indeed in a predicament. The orcs were generous with treats, and even with her friends, she couldn't manage the mountain of fruit the orcs had brought, which wasn't even getting smaller. Armonia decided to distract the orcs who were trying so hard to feed her, and ask where they got the rumour of the start of the war, since no one goes into such wilderness. The orcs replied that they had been visited by a man wearing a cloth quite like Armonia's. They were probably talking about the robe. He had told them of impending trouble that could not be left to chance. Of the details they remembered, there was a pattern on his face, covered by bandages, and red eyes with a faint glow. But the most important thing was the dark, ominous energy that emanated from the guest. It was too much like that of the powerful creatures called demons. The orc must be wrong, for demons are creatures that rarely leave their world. It is not to their advantage to interfere aimlessly in the affairs of humans and monsters. But the monster was sure it was the same creature. Armonia was worried, because this made the situation even more confusing and dangerous, but she didn't dare to jump to conclusions. Now it was the girl's turn to fulfill her promise. She told the orcs of her goal, hoping they would believe her. There was no better solution than to try to talk first than to fight mindlessly. The monsters were mistrustfully silent, but they were distrustful of all humans, excluding Harmony, so there was no problem. Meanwhile, Lime put the girl's overflowing stomach out of its misery by devouring a mountain of fruit and falling asleep with satiety, ignoring Ferry's irritated rebukes. Slime had grown so large he could barely move. The orcs were hospitable. Knowing that such creatures had a vicious appetite, they saw nothing wrong with it. And while Armonia was urging Lime not to fall asleep after eating, citing the fact that it was very harmful, the head of the orcs expressed his disapproval of the decision of the monsters of the Voltar forest to let the girl go alone right into the lair of those evil people. Ferry exhaled disappointedly, agreeing with the thought. But this decision had been made by Armonia herself, determined to protect her family and home. There was something about her inside that fascinated the monsters, and that's why they were so attracted to her. It is a truly unusual trait that cannot be resisted. That's why, according to Ferry, a certain dragon of the forest, Voltar, watches over her, even if she hasn't summoned him. The creatures value their human as their own lives. Therefore, everyone considers it his duty to protect her happiness and light. After 3 days, the girl bid farewell to the extremely hospitable orcs, promising to fulfill her promise. All this time, they were having a good time and were fed. But there was one significant nuance. Armonia had no chance to take a nap for at least 10 minutes, so she left the orc shelter on her last legs. Her friends could clearly see how tired the girl was, so they decided not to wait until they arrived in the village and sat Armonia down to rest by a tree. The girl took advantage of the moment and immediately fell asleep. The girl's condition was dreadful. Ferry respected the good-natured Armonia's decision, for she was going to do such hard work for their own sake. Lime, on the other hand, was indignant that she had to carry so much on her shoulders. Perhaps if they had stopped her in time and kept her out of the forest, none of this would have happened. The argument was interrupted by the confident but calm voice of a man whose scarlet strands of hair fluttered in the fresh forest breeze. He looked like an elf. Yet the girl's companions called him by the name of the very Caris, who was obliged to guard her. The forest dragon had come personally to make sure that the girl was all right. Caris was well aware that even with the monsters banned, Armonia would not change her mind, such was her nature. The man knelt before the exhausted girl, lightly adjusting the strands of hair that had fallen into her face. The necklace was just a kind of cover. It alerted Caris to the girl's condition, but even without waiting for a signal, he kept a secret eye on her from time to time. He became convinced that the girl was simply tired. A few hours of rest would help her recover and continue on her way again. Concerned, Lime asked about the possibility of bringing Armonia back to the forest. But Caris was sure she would not be harmed under his protection, so he left her free to do as she wished, and the blame for keeping her locked up for so long was on their shoulders. Lime couldn't calm down and grieved as he watched the events unfold. What if she loved the humans more by virtue of her origin and left them? And to this Caris found the answer. Such an outcome of events was not feasible. Armonia was not simple. There was no way she could leave them. Dragon knew that the girl loved her ancestral home more than anyone else, and so she would never betray her family. Caris had only come for a short time, so he climbed back up, and while the fire-coloured seal appeared under his feet, took a promise from Ferry and Lime to hide from Armonia that he was visiting her, leaving the forest unattended for a while. After receiving his consent, Caris smiled and asked him to take good care of the girl in his absence. With those words, he disappeared, leaving behind only a few vaporized tongues of flame. Caris and Armonia seemed to be of the same berry, according to the fairy's observations, who understood each other half-heartedly. Suddenly, footsteps were heard. They definitely belonged to humans, so the monsters decided to quickly hide from their gaze in the bushes. If they dared to harm their dear Armonia, they would be in trouble. But it was a squad led by Haider, who had probably been looking for the girl all this time. Kuhn, who was bored with the monotonous detour, wanted to return as soon as possible, but the Chancellor's confidence made him keep quiet. Obviously, the girl was important to him. The unexpected report of a man in sight by the tree brought hope back to the commander. He hastily made his way to the tree where Armonia was sleeping sweetly. The man crouched down in front of the girl and made sure she was just sleeping. Her breathing was stable, and there was no hint of injury. It seemed that he should have calmed down after the successful completion of the search. But Kuhn could see how sensitive their commander was right now. He hadn't slept much at night either, so he could get agitated over anything. Haider ordered a healer to be brought in, and he himself took the sleeping girl carefully in his arms. It was only then that he was able to scrutinize her face after so long. Her sky-blue hair showed from behind the dark cloak that had hidden it all this time. The man immediately recalled the rumors the locals had heard about a similar girl who could control monsters. Haider distinctly remembered that they had first met in a village adjacent to the Voltar forest. Everything fell into place. He had no idea that this fragile girl would become a treasure to him. Sometime later, Armonia awoke in a spacious, bright room, richly decorated and wearing a clean shirt. She jumped up from the bed, trying to hastily realize what was happening. How long had it been while she'd been asleep? What was scarier was that her friends were not responding. They were probably hiding somewhere nearby while the men took her away. Grabbing a blanket and throwing it on like a cloak to hide her hair, the girl ran barefoot out of the room, hoping to get her companions back as soon as possible. The girl thrashed about, searching for a door to the outside. The blanket she had wrapped herself in was too long, and one of her steps was unfortunate. She stepped on the tip of it and prepared to fall, but found herself in the arms of a passing Haider. The Chancellor did not understand where the girl was in such a hurry in her sleep, and the traveller had even more questions. First of all, where are they? And while the man puzzledly held the blanket, trying to guess its purpose on the girl's head, he answered that now they were guests in the mansion of Baron Pecan. Haider explained that in the morning he and the squad, which had not been recalled all these days, had found her sleeping under a tree in the forest and brought her here. According to the healer, she should have recovered after resting, so the man inquired about the girl's condition. Armonia was surprised at what she thought was gratuitous concern, but thanked the man for his search, embarrassingly covering her face with the hood of her blanket. Cautiously, the girl clarified if they had noticed anyone near her, to which she received a negative answer. That was a relief. She answered briefly, and then went back to looking for a way out. Haider headed after her, trying to stop and cool her ardour at least for a little while. After she recovered, they would go to the capital again. But as it turned out, that was not the girl's plan. Armonia, since there was talk of it, offered to travel separately from now on, which dumbfounded the man. The only thing that kept her going was the promise she'd made to Haider. And considering how many lives the girl had saved, the debt for the mantle had long since been repaid. People didn't listen to her at all, and didn't take the girl's words seriously. Armonia could not correct the mistakes of warriors so often. It was hard and tedious work to bear such responsibility. Turning around, she added that it wasn't Haider's fault here. It was simply time to go her own way. She thanked the man for saving her, but asked him not to worry about her anymore. She would do the same. Armonia offered to end their contract on that note, and Haider couldn't find the words and grew gloomy before his eyes. Armonia's plan is to break the contract right now, and then find Ferry and Lime and go with them to the capital. Haider, on the other hand, had opposite plans. He couldn't let the girl leave so easily. Approaching her, the man took her in his arms and carried her back to her chambers. He left the girl no choice but to insist on a good rest. Armonia wasn't sure if the Chancellor understood her words correctly, so she repeated that she wanted to finish her work. She was full of energy and tried to get out of Haider's strong arms that wouldn't let her go. A little amused at the girl's indignation, the man explained that since the contract was consensual, it would be on the same terms to stagnate, and for his part, he was unwilling to do so. With those words, Haider sat the girl back down on her bed, remaining in front of the bed. He still needed Armonia's help, so she would have to stay with their unit against her will. And yet the man was not such a tyrant. He had a lucrative offer for the girl, so that she too would not work in vain. It was information about Chancellor Hyde. Armonia thought that as soon as she arrived in the capital, she would be able to meet with him immediately. But the Chancellor is the king's chief crony, so he can't spontaneously make appointments with just anyone. But moreover, the security measures in the capital are much stricter than those in the villages, so she simply wouldn't be allowed to go there without a special reason. Haider introduced himself as a close friend of his, which might well be the case, for by the looks of it, he held no small position. And if Armonia continued to work with Candy, he would make sure she met the Chancellor in the capital. And any information about him wouldn't be a problem. Haider could tell a lot about himself. The offer was undoubtedly advantageous, so the girl sank down, realizing that she didn't have much choice. Haider smilingly reached for the blanket over the girl's head to remove it, but the girl quickly pushed his hand away, saying she didn't like to show her face, nor those who spread their arms. The information came down on her as if from heaven, and she couldn't give a clear answer so quickly, so she asked for time to think. The commander didn't mind, but asked him not to take too long to answer. That would have been the end of the conversation, but Haider stayed where he was. There was one question he had, and he couldn't quite put the puzzle together. It was a matter of how Armonia had managed to escape unharmed from a mob of dangerous cannibal monsters that had turned around and stopped their assault for no reason. The girl did not know what to answer, so she put all the responsibility on luck, which surprisingly accompanied her everywhere and always. Haider realized that it was too absurd without some understated details. The smile on his face was not so natural and friendly. Behind it was a longing for a confession that this was not a blessing from heaven, but a strong bond with their enemies. The girl began to justify herself, trying to push guilt as before, reminding herself of Hyde's slowness. And since he is involved in the suppression, she decided to step back from the opportunity to reveal herself by asking what the monsters are so hated by the commander personally. His answer was the same as it had been the first time. Monsters only brought suffering to humans by their existence. More and more senseless victims were being caused by them. Destroying them would not only bring safety, but also a chance to enrich the empire with resources from the forest. To Armonia, this was a load of nonsense. Just like humans, there are both bad and good monsters that don't attack humans. To not know this was complete ignorance. Besides, the girl genuinely couldn't understand the concern for the resources of a forest that didn't even belong to humans originally. She thought that the conflict with the wyverns showed all sides of the conflict clearly, but she was wrong. Haider decided to ask the obvious question: is Armonia on the side of the monsters? The girl was in no hurry to answer, and the best solution was to just leave this tedious conversation. Not wanting to clarify the relationship, the girl referred to fatigue and began to push the man out the door, not giving him a chance to speak. In an instant, the door slammed in Haider's face, and he was just getting to the best part. Henceforth, he resolved to be more selective in his words. His future plans, which the girl had not yet suspected, could only be realized with her help. If you think about it that way, the words candy make sense, and the girl needs his help to meet such an important person. She didn't even have anyone to consult with to make a decision. In thought, she opened the window and looked down. What was her surprise when she saw her little keepers, Lime hanging on the wall and groaning with exhaustion, and Ferry flying nearby and rebuking the slime for being weak. Armonia dragged her friends into the room. It turned out that they wanted to climb in through the window and had been waiting all this time for Haider to finish her endless conversations and leave. The girl was glad to see her friends in one piece and thanked them for finding her. The guardians were only too happy to try and began to argue again about who valued the traveller more. Armonia suggested that instead of quarrelling, the friends should wash themselves, for they were all muddy. They gladly agreed. But the idyll was interrupted by another knock at the door. Annoyed at this intrusiveness, the girl opened the door, standing with a satisfied smile and a stack of clean clothes in her hands. He had only come to give it to her. The girl thanked the man and slammed the door in his face again. The girl thanked the man and slammed the door in his face again. The traveller threw freshly laundered clothes over her friends and told them to hide in the closet until they were alone again. Armonia opened the door disdainfully. Haider decided to wonder if the girl had thought about the contract, for a quarter of a day had already passed, and they needed to be on their way tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. The young man was too insistent, even though he had warned that time was limited. It was as if he knew the outcome of events in advance, and now he only waited for confirmation. Armonia recognized that Haider was right, for without his help she was unlikely to meet so easily with so significant a person. But in return for her trust, she demanded proof that the commander was truly connected to the Chancellor and not simply leading her around for his own gain. Haider had always thought that the girl usually acted without thinking of the consequences, but as it turned out, there were times when she tried to find out everything thoroughly. At this, Armonia tried to close the door again, but the man managed to put up a hand, preventing her from doing so. The girl was already having a hard time tolerating his intrusiveness. His strong arm prevented Armonia from hiding behind the door. She questioningly exclaimed where such strength came from. Haider kindly explained that in his position, good physical fitness was necessary. He practiced fencing and trained in martial arts, where it was always necessary. The girl didn't need that information. She was interested in the question of why the man trembled so much at the sight of monsters when he could at least run away. The question embarrassed Haider. He replied that it was an inborn phobia and asked me not to ask him such personal questions again. As for the monsters, word had reached the commander that the ogres that had attacked the carriages had reached the village, killing more than half of its inhabitants. This news only confirmed Haider's words about the cruelty of monsters who didn't care who they killed. But such dire news did not surprise Armonia. She reminded the man that she had told him earlier that the price for that foolish choice in the forest would be high. Haider was astonished. It turned out that the girl had known about the trouble in advance, but had simply kept silent, treating it so indifferently. Armonia continued to explain that the monsters wouldn't sacrifice anything, and they needed something equal to the carriages they had left behind. The girl's tone grew more and more serious. She put her hand on Haider's shoulder, reiterating that their choices would have consequences, and if the commander was not sure that the knights would listen to him without question, would he be able to bear the burden of repeated sacrifices time after time? And most importantly, was he convinced that he would really play into his hands one way with her? With these words, the girl returned to her chambers. The next morning, the girl was already on her feet from the earliest hour, and despite her comrades' concern that she had not had enough rest because of the pestering commander, she assured them that everything was all right. It wasn't because of him that Armonia had gone to bed late. She was probably tormented by her own thoughts that kept her awake. She only said with a smile on her face that she already knew what it was like to deal with him. Ferry noticed her positive attitude. She noticed that Armonia seemed to enjoy spending time with people, even though she denied it. The girl justified herself by saying that her opinion had not changed at all. On the way out, Armonia, poking her fingers lightly and wrinkling her cheeks, tried to remember if she was really smiling when talking about Hyde. It was impossible, because at the mere thought of him, the girl began to boil with anger. Haider met her again on the way. He asked her where she was going at such an early hour. She told him as she was, to buy fruit, which she needed to eat from time to time. In the end, the man imposed himself on her under the pretext of wanting to eat ripe fruit too. Armonia was annoyed by his presence, so she decided she'd just get on with it and go back. This market was different from the ones she'd been to before, quiet and empty. The man explained that there was an orc horde close to the village. The men were afraid of a sudden attack, so they stayed in their hiding places. Haider recognized that the village was now intact, thanks to Armonia's efforts, and the fact that she had talked to the monsters, which he had clearly seen with his own eyes. He drew such a conclusion from the fact that the girl's luck was too stable, so it could probably be considered an ability as well. The man, after pausing for a moment and waiting for the right moment, asked if Armonia remembered asking him about his phobia. And then Haider described his horrible memories of how one day when he was a child, trouble came to his family. They couldn't survive the monsters. All of the boy's family died, and he could only watch it, helplessly trembling and weak, even in his own mind. The man sank back into heavy reflection. Perhaps if he had been braver and stronger in that moment, his family would be alive now. And now he could only dream of those horrible memories. But the girl banished the pessimistic attitude by pulling Haider down by the long strands of hair near his face. This unexpected action brought him back to reality. Armonia blurted out that it wasn't his fault here. Even though she knew they had completely different views of the world, the girl could say with certainty that this situation was not at the man's mercy. She understood his feelings, knowing what it was like to leave his family behind. So Hyde's reason for participating in the raid was a kind of revenge. But would he cease to be troubled by these dark memories and dreams if he were to swoop down on the monsters like a storm? Few would consider destroying all humans if one of them hurt him. But until that day, Haider had never imagined that monsters were bloodthirsty. His examples were only damage and injuries at the hands of these creatures, so it was hard for him to accept the girl's thoughts. But Armonia didn't expect to change the man's mind immediately. The man confessed that perhaps that was the reason he needed the traveller so much. He took her hand, telling her that she was the first person he had ever let know the details of the tragedy. Armonia didn't appreciate the gesture, however. She released her hand from Haider's grasp and said she hadn't asked him to do it. The man didn't stop. He was as honest as possible. That's why he said it was the first step to earn the trust of his guide. But that wasn't enough, so he pulled out a document and unfolded it in front of Armonia. It was an authorization to enter the Imperial Tower, signed by none other than Chancellor Haider. It was a document that allowed one to meet him, regardless of status or business. The commander promised to give her this valuable permission when they reached the capital. She was left to decide whether she would continue on her way with the squad of the man who had so cleverly led her astray. The document was similar in design to a raid order. It must be real. It was solid evidence that could not be disputed. The troop should leave in the morning or at noon, depending on the time. Armonia told Haider that if she didn't show up by then, they would leave without her. The man was struck by lightning at that statement. He began to question the girl as to why she was again not honouring the arrangements, for he had provided everything and more, so that Armonia had no doubts. But the girl needed to consult her friends before agreeing to this venture. She referred to her urgent business that might come up, leaving the man without further details. Judging from Haider's reaction, he really hadn't lied to her, so she thanked Candy with a smile for convincing her. It was late at night, as the moon illuminated the room with its cold light, and Armonia stared wistfully out the window, while Fairy reprimanded Lime for yet another gluttony. The fairy couldn't just leave the girl's condition alone, for even with her excuses about feeling good, it was all written on her face. Armonia knew it was hard for her friends to travel in stuffy bag conditions, so she worried that she was forcing them to do it against their will. Fairy realised at once that the girl was thinking about the road to the capital, which was still quite a long way off. Yesterday, while waiting for Haider to leave, they had overheard the entire conversation. The angry fairy had lit up, covering the man with condemnations for his perfidy. However, it was about Armonia's comfort, so the monsters unanimously decided to be patient. The girl was confused by this decision, not understanding why they had been prioritizing her comfort since her arrival. The reason was simple. Armonia is hotly favored by the monsters. They think of her far more often than she hears about it. Her kindness completely enveloped them and enchanted them. The girl seemed used to hearing about it, but for some reason right now the moment felt much different. The next morning, the carriages were ready for departure. The only thing missing was Armonia, who was running late. Haider insisted on waiting for her until the very end. Moreover, for her comfort, he had filled the carriage with fruit, remembering her words of yesterday. Finally, the familiar brown robe showed itself. With the arrival of the girl, a smile shone on the man's face, and it was decided to set off. We moved to the Voltar forest, where Karis, sitting in a tree, feels the forest changing in Armonia's absence. The wind has grown stronger and colder, unsettling every living thing in the thicket. The silence was interrupted by a troll who had decided to visit the forest dragon. She could not help but notice that he was depressed. Without Armonia, it was as if the forest had lost its vibrancy and energy. She was the one who wandered its overgrown paths day after day, enjoying its scenic beauty. The troll couldn't let go of the thought that they might lose their ray of light. Humans weren't that big of a problem. Much more dangerous was the fact that Armonia might be threatened by monsters from the forests in the neighborhood, eager to get their hands on her extraordinary power. The night fairy and the slime couldn't protect her from all harm, and the pendant Karis had given her as a protection wasn't so reliable. The forest dragon still insisted that the monsters were worrying about Armonia unnecessarily. He had spoken to her more than once about her power, which should not be used rashly, so he was confident in her future prudent decisions. Karis descended to the ground as he approached the troll, concluding that as long as Armonia was under his protection and loved by the native forest, she would be safe. Meanwhile, the suppression squad ran into trouble again. Armonia tried to lead the carriages along a safe path, but somehow the mob of monsters managed to outrun them, as if they were tracking them. This time they were creatures with a much more aggressive attitude. This was the first time Armonia had seen such lizards, similar to wyverns, but lacking wings. She thought back to the monsters, which were generalized as drakes. Haider, holding the girl by the shoulders behind him, was not happy to meet these creatures. It turned out that this was not their first encounter, and in previous times they had clashed with heavy casualties and severe injuries, for the drakes did not calculate their moves at all and attacked indiscriminately. In short, the monsters of this species were the most aggressive of those encountered along the way. But how did Kande know so much about them? Even Armonia had seen them in person for the first time, due to the lack of prevalence of this species. The girl heard one of the monsters say that he had caught the scent of the man who had caught their leader. She immediately asked the man about it. He was amazed by the girl's insight. Then he confessed that in the past he had actually gotten one drake for research, thanks to which he was able to gather so much information about these dangerous creatures. But since meeting the girl, the man had never laid a finger on any of the monsters, so it was a thing of the past. In the past, but it was not forgotten. The situation had become awkward, for once again Armonia had rebuked the humans for stupidity, the consequences of which surfaced again and again. The conversation was interrupted by the drakes, who decided that people exchange signals before attacking. The best solution was to attack first. Armonia glanced warily at the lizard, her hand stopping the discussion with Haider. The drake's jaws lit up with a bright flame that after a couple moments burst outward in a sizzling pillar of fire, intent on destroying both heroes. Armonia stood frozen like a predator's prey before death as the commander's sword flew in front of her face, cutting through the flames. The girl found herself in the arms of a man selflessly protecting her. Candy's reactions were superb, and her physical abilities were beyond all expectations. The traveller had always thought he was just an arrogant, rich aristocrat who was incapable of anything. But the way he'd changed since the day they'd met the ogres made her change her mind. Haider took a moment to notice that the creatures were as strong as they had been in the past. Armonia firmly ordered everyone to hide in the carriages again, while she sorted things out. But her words were interrupted by a gesture from the man as he adjusted the girl's hood that had come off in the attack. The man could not lose his valuable guide again while he would be holed up in the carriage. So this time, he felt it his duty to protect the girl from harm. The lizards, noticing the man's sword, recognized him as their commander's captor, so they immediately turned their attention to him. The squad began to aim at the places free of scales, intending at least to fend off the attacks. Stubborn Armonia saw no point in waiting until the battle was over. The monsters were attacking too chaotically and recklessly, and the forest could be engulfed in flames in no time. She ran toward the crowd of monsters, sticking to the edge and looking for the new leader. There was one among the drakes who spoke more clearly than the others. It must be him, but it was dangerous to approach him on the ground, risking attack by deadly flames. Armonia took a quick look around, taking note of the vines hanging between the trees. Since the drakes couldn't fly, there was nothing left but to pounce on them from above. She jumped nimbly and grabbed one of the vines and ran straight to the target. She ended up right on the monster's neck, which silenced both of them for a second, comprehending what was happening. The lizard tried to throw Armonia off, insistently shouting that she intended to talk. Finally, she was heard. The call to calm was brought to her attention by the lizard she had ridden, realizing that he was being spoken to in his language. Armonia began to assure the monster that she did not intend to engage in combat, so it would be in the interests of both sides to negotiate peace without casualties. For her part, she would do her best to compromise. The lizards felt the power enveloping the girl, causing them to freeze briefly, as if stupefied by her charms. However, the sudden earthquake changed the course of events in an instant. The girl felt as if the support under her feet had evaporated, causing her to fly rapidly into the abyss. Haider was terrified and started calling the girl's name, unable to do anything about it. In the fall, Armonia's pendant cracked and glowed brightly, alerting the unsuspecting Karis to the imminent tragedy. The horde of monsters and humans stopped their action, staring at the ground that had so suddenly fallen into the abyss. Armonia and one of the lizards she'd landed on were under the ground too. Haider, completely without thinking his decision through, rushed toward the ravine, intending to jump to the girl's aid, shouting her name and hoping to hear a response. His reckless act was stopped by Kun, who ran after him and blocked his path. Begging him to calm down and stop, he reminded him that the Chancellor himself had forbidden knights to act without a thoughtful plan, and now he himself wanted to sacrifice his life for the unknown. This brought Haider to his senses. He put his palm to his forehead and thought hard about what to do next. At this time, Armonia woke up in an underground tunnel to the calls of her friends trying to wake her up. Her body was fine, even though she had fallen from such a great height. Ferry assumed it was due to the soft ground, but even that wouldn't have saved her from such a fall. It turned out that it was Lime who had once again become the traveller's airbag, softening her landing considerably. Then Armonia thanked the slime for saving her. The girl tried to look around. Even with Ferry's presence, from which a light, soft light was emanating, only the ground and the long passages were only slightly visible around her. She was startled by the now familiar voice of the lizard noticing her awakening. The two of them had fallen into those passages when the ground fell away from under their feet, and now they were both forced to find a way out. Drake had thought it was the pranks of humans using power so recklessly, but Armonia, who was also in this difficult situation, was a rebuttal. She decided to introduce herself, calling herself a resident of the Voltar forest. The lizard wasn't all that surprised by this. He immediately sensed that the girl was under the protection of the forest dragon. That was probably what he called Karis. Both the girl and the drake had no idea where these underground passages led. Lime assumed that the living earth was evidence of the presence of the earth spirit Nadium, who could help them get out of here. All that remained was to find him. The dwarf would also prove a useful guide in these confusing tunnels. Armonia had met them before, but only once in the forest. These small creatures rarely left their usual habitats, but still occasionally appeared outside. Empty chatter wouldn't change anything, so they all set off together. On the way, Armonia decided to ask the lizard about their story, since she couldn't hear it in detail during the battle. Drake said that it wasn't their leader who had been caught first, but his cub. When he learned of this, he went in search of him, but ended up trapped by the humans himself. His pack had intended to go with him, but the leader had insisted on going alone. The girl was shocked by the cruelty of people. How could anyone sit idly by in such a situation? It was only natural that the lizards would fight for the freedom of their fellow creatures. A leader has a great influence on his subordinates. She compared these circumstances with her own, unable to imagine the Voltar forest without Karis. Then Armonia assumed that since the leader of the drakes had fallen into the hands of humans, he was now in the hands of the higher-ups, so attacking ordinary humans would not bear any fruit, but would only make things worse. She was willing to try to get the lizard leader back, though she was annoyed that she had to deal with people's rash behaviour so often alone. In return, Armonia asked a favour. Once they were out of the dungeon, the lizard would lead his pack away, clearing the way for the carriages and saving the travellers' precious time. She gave the drake time to consider the decision, for it was not easy to trust a stranger in such a situation. There was silence. The girl looked around at the road opening up ahead, thinking that they shouldn't expect any trouble from the direct route. This way they were unlikely to get lost and would soon get somewhere. At that moment, the travellers were being watched by a creature of small stature, emitting a light golden glow. The path seemed endless. The tunnels were so monotonous that it felt like walking in circles. The travellers did not even mark the path they had taken, which made the task more difficult. Armonia was exhausted. She couldn't keep going, so she asked everyone to stop for a moment to rest and crouched down on the ground, wrapping her legs around her straining legs. Ferry suggested that the girl stay here, and she and Lime would quickly look around and find the dwarf. It was the only way out of the situation, because such a long journey was becoming a burden. Armonia felt guilty as she rested while her friends worked, but they assured her that everything was fine, so she need not worry. Ferry strictly instructed the obviously tired of reproaches Drake to take care of the girl, and herself went with Lime to search. The lizard had picked up on the fact that Armonia was cared for by many creatures besides the dragon, that she was surrounded on all sides by protection and care. The lizard, recalling the girl's offer, announced his decision, and his answer was positive. This surprised the girl, for she had been prepared rather for rejection than for such an act so crazy from the outside. Armonia clarified that on the way out, the Drake would not be able to change his answer as easily. This seemed to offend the Drake somewhat, and he said that he always kept the word that came out of his own mouth. The decision seemed unbelievable to her, causing her to wonder if the lizard had accepted the offer based on logic or influenced by her sweet, stupefying monster scent. Drake was puzzled by her question, but admitted that he did smell her luscious odour, but his answer wasn't based on that factor alone. He didn't mention the second, which didn't bother the girl that much. Armonia heaved herself to her feet, offering to continue on her way. It seemed to the lizard that human resource was as easily replenished as it was squandered, but the girl was still having a hard time. A full rest on the ground was impossible, and they could not afford to waste time. At that time, Armony's prankster friends showed up with a victory cry. Inside the slime was none other than the expert of the entire dungeon, a dwarf. The gnome was in poor health, having tasted the slime liquid. Now this day would be a cursed day for him. He was beyond pissed off, and the object of his disruption was Armonia, standing in front of him with a guilty look. The enraged dwarf accused the traveller of all sins, especially of pissing off their lord, who had awakened from the destruction of the earth and rock. Armonia was perplexed by how loud the battle with the drakes had been, causing the ground to separate, forming a chasm. The girl tried to find out where they were now. The dwarf, of course, knew the answer. Moreover, he knew exactly where Nadium was, but he refused to take lost travellers to him. The lord would only get more angry when he saw the perpetrators of the whole incident, so the gnome was not at all eager to inform the lost creatures. But such an arrangement was resolved at once. Lime threatened with a hungry smile that next time he would digest the gnome in no time. Nothing would change from the crumb's disappearance, but the slime's hunger would subside a bit. The gnome, under pressure and blackmail, instantly changed his mind. The dungeon expert guided the travellers to Nadium with visible resentment. There was a little way to go, but the smell of dirt only grew stronger as they approached. Finally, a bluish light from the gorge appeared ahead. What the travellers saw was hard to describe in words. A majestic tree with bright blue leaves and red fruit, with grass of the same colour, and butterflies fluttering around it. The place was like a paradise in the midst of the mortal world, but not a dungeon, and beneath this beautiful tree rested a young man, whom the dwarf addressed respectfully, informing him of his guests. It was Nadium, the guardian of the land. Nadium, the guardian of the land, noticed the strangers and expressed his displeasure at the interruption of their sweet sleep. Usually guardian spirits, once they had settled on a permanent place, lived a sedentary life, rarely travelling anywhere, so it was a good fortune to meet them. Armonia thought that all of them had the appearance of elders, but as it turned out, there are also such youths that now appeared before them. The girl explained that they had been brought here by a gnome who had escaped from the scene of the crime. She wanted to meet him to ask him to let them out. Nadium was outraged at such insolence. Not only had they allowed themselves to ravage the land, burn countless trees, interrupt his sleep, break into his nook, but they dared to demand something of him. It wasn't Armonia's fault, though. The spirit could have warned her that she was resting, but she couldn't have known about it. The girl was pretty straightforward, which might have angered the spirit even more, but the truth was also somewhat on her side. It wasn't easy for them, and they had to worry about the baby sleeping deep underground. Guardian raised his hand above the ground, summoning the young green vines from beneath, surrounding the girl and her companions. He ordered her to address him as a lord, not a boy. He watched in amazement as Armonia's little friends diligently tried to free her from the bonds of the plants. It was the first time he could see monsters assisting humans. Curiosity overcame the young spirit. The stranger clearly possessed powers beyond his instincts. He offered to let Armonia's companions go if she would stay here as his plaything. The proposal was absurd, so everyone unanimously began to refuse it. The girl had too much to do outside, so she couldn't just leave it like that. The spirit, childishly resentful, disdainfully turned away, refusing to act in any other way. Then she remembered Kanda, teaching her the basics of contract work. She did not attach importance to the fact that she was learning from him, and perceived him as some kind of authority on negotiation matters. An offer to draw up an agreement followed. Armonia offered, in return for letting them out, to visit him when his business upstairs was finished. She was obliged to keep her promise, for too many creatures depended on her, and the condition to stay with him forever Nadium must have set because he was bored with being alone in this picturesque but secluded place. But the child was stubborn. Everything the girl had said earlier sounded like utter nonsense to him. This place was natural for him to stay, and yes, his body was much more perfect, so loneliness was also inherent. Armonia tried unsuccessfully to get the spirit into favourable dialogue, but the child wanted only entertainment, and otherwise all the traveller's friends would remain in its domain. A formidable voice objected to his whims. It was Karis, who had come to his ward's aid, angry at the young guardian's insolent behaviour in trespassing. Armonia was so happy to see her protector that she immediately jumped into his arms. Karis was always there for her, and even without severe damage to the pendant, he could sense the changes in the girl's life. He was ready to come to her aid at any moment, wherever she was. But even Karis could not have guessed that the young guardian would hide so carefully. The child persisted in denying his youth, in his attempts to discover who the creature that troubled him was. Karis became convinced of the immaturity of the spirit, for he was not even capable of determining its dragon essence. Karis didn't think to negotiate for long. He threatened to burn Nadium's habitat to the ground if he didn't let everyone go now. Nadium desperately insisted that he would not change his mind, casually calling the dragon a scoundrel. Armonia, worried that even in this quiet place a scuffle would break out, asked for the swearing to stop. She had promised Nadium that she would certainly visit him, but Karis had firmly forbidden it. Armonia's long absence from the forest will not lead to anything good. Her family is worried and waiting for her soon return, and guardian spirits always go through a journey of loneliness, such is their nature and purpose. It was unclear to him why the traveller was so reverently protective of him for no particular reason. Armonia insisted that being so young, it was hard to experience loneliness. She confessed to the forest guardian that when she had given up on humans and arrived in the forest to the monsters, she had been helped to stay afloat by her new family, who had enveloped her with care from all sides. Karis and the other forest dwellers had become a real outlet for the little girl who had suddenly lost everything. And that first day in the Voltar forest was clearly remembered by both of them. Karis distinctly remembered how the child had come into his domain of her own free will, clutching in her small, trembling hands the magic stone the monsters had given her. But even in that state, the girl did not avoid his gaze. Her enveloping energy and sweet fragrance drew attention immediately as she came even a little closer. The Quanya child had come to the Voltar forest. Such children are born for unknown reasons with abilities no one can explain. The places where they live are overflowing with life. When a Quanya baby is born, the monsters, stupefied by their powerful pheromones, take the babies to themselves to feed on their energy, amplifying their own. This cycle repeats until the baby is eaten along with its flesh. The fate of these people is predetermined. That's why they don't live more than 20 years. The pheromone-addled monsters wanted to make a quick profit without looking into the future, and Karis was unwilling to follow such a path. The long life of such a valuable child could bring even greater benefits. Karis welcomed the girl into the family, giving her a helping hand and announcing that the child was now a member of the Voltar Forest family. That was the Guardian's decision. Karis raised and nurtured Armonia like his own daughter, constantly teaching her to adapt to life in the forest. He had an excellent knowledge of monsters and plants, and gradually passed on his valuable knowledge to the curious young woman. His endless lonely days became filled with meaning. Armonia was always by his side, adopting Karis's routine and adjusting to life in an unfamiliar place. Although as a child, Armonia had longed for her parents, over the years she had accepted the Voltar Forest as her home, so the dragon felt there would be no unnecessary hassle. But one day the apprentice dared to go out to the humans to observe their lives. It happened again and again, but Karis dismissed it as mere curiosity. And so, on the day that Armonia learned of the impending trouble, the peace of the forest was shaken. A worried girl came running to the guardian of the forest, holding in her hands a paper authorizing the raid. Humans were so obsessed with greed for forest resources that they were willing to shake the already strained relationship between their world and the monster world, which was the result of reckless bravery. Armonia announced that day that she intended to leave the forest to save her family. The girl sincerely wanted to help the one who had been by her side all along. Karis is strong, so he would have no trouble resisting such a raid, but it is better to deal with the problem by avoiding war and casualties. Karis should have rebuffed her, but he could not afford to do so. The determination and firmness of Armonia's conviction of her position made her shine as never before. And then Karis willed her to do as she herself wished. It was not at all impossible that the dragon had fallen under her powerful spell, or even succumbed to her influence, changed. He was sure of one thing for sure. Karis's memories were an extension of what Armonia needed to know now, being imprisoned underground. She firmly believed she had made it to this day, thanks to her family never leaving her. Loneliness overtakes every creature, even a powerful guardian spirit. Karis could not resist the girl's extraordinary strength even now. He took her hand fondly and said that even with all the time he had spent with her, he was unable to comprehend her amazing human nature. Armonia found sympathy even when someone didn't deserve it, choosing the hard and thorny road of life. And at times like this, he couldn't stop admiring her. Karis drew the girl's hand to his, placing it gently against his forehead, savouring the moment of special familial intimacy. The dragon even now allowed the girl to do what she thought was right. He didn't care how she spent her time with the stubborn young man. The only thing that mattered to him was that she returned to him safe and sound. It was another defeat of a powerful being to the fragile maiden who filled the void in his heart. The dragon only had to take care of the girl's safety again. Armonia pulled the cracked pendant out of her bag, handing it to Karis. She always carried it there so she wouldn't lose it. Magically, the pendant became whole again. The dragon carefully hooked it around the girl's neck, asking her not to worry in vain about losing it and to wear it always. Now that the Forest Guardian's permission was granted, Armonia was free to go wherever she wanted with Nadium. But the spirit said that he didn't need the dragon's approval at all, but that if the girl wanted to go with him, he would go with her. It was a kind of consent. The kid was quite rude, and even when Armonia introduced herself and asked to be called by her name, he blurted out that he would decide how to address her himself. Karis regretted his agreement with every second and was about to withdraw it, but the girl assured him that everything was under control. It was time to head back to the Kanda, who was probably not finding a place to be up there. Karis had done his part here too, and the forest couldn't go long without his protection. The girl thanked her keeper with a smile for his timely help. The dragon had only one question left. Disappearing in his scarlet glowing seal, he placed his palm against Armonia's cheek, asking if she was satisfied with reality. The girl admitted that it was harder than she had imagined, but adventure always brought her pleasure. Karis had had enough of that answer, and he went into the forest, promising to wait for her there. The travellers got out with the help of Nadium's powers. The Guardian had cleverly disguised himself as a human by applying the powers of illusion to his elongated greenish ears, so there should have been no question about his origins. And now it was time for the lizard to keep his word. He decided to leave their head and his child on Armonia. The girl, smiling ingratiatingly, vowed that she would fulfill her promise brilliantly, for she does not do otherwise. Drake was satisfied with the answer. He raised his head to the sky, letting out a wild roar, calling for his troop to return to their lair. His kin heard the call and immediately retreated into the forest. The squad and Haider were once again puzzled by the lizard's behaviour, for they had no reason to retreat at all. It was pointless to go in pursuit, for the commander was intent on rescuing his guide. And then Armonia's voice came from the forest, causing the man to turn sharply toward her. The girl stood awkwardly, holding the hand of the childishly frowning guardian of the land. Haider ran up to the arrivals, reverently inspecting Armonia for wounds or injuries. He began to make hasty excuses that he couldn't have come to her sooner, since the drakes were both not attacking and preventing them from laying down their weapons. The situation was desperate. The girl stopped the man's panic, placing her palm in front of his face as a sign to calm down. She was more than fine. But the child, standing with an important look beside her, was a curious addition. Armonia made up a story on the fly that she found him in the dungeon. He had come from the capital and was lost, so she had decided out of the goodness of her heart to help find his family. Haider pondered for a moment and realized that there was no choice but to take him with him. It would be very rash to leave him here alone in the middle of the forest, but in return, Armonia must take full responsibility for him. While the man was speaking, the girl noticed a wound on Haider's wrist, probably from a battle with the drakes. The wound was deep, and dirt or infection could enter it at any moment. The man offered to stop at the nearest village for a medical checkup, but the girl ignored his words, searching through her bag for something. Haider was frustrated by Armonia's silence, unsure how to approach her, but the girl interrupted the commander, grabbing his arm and asking him to be quiet. His fidgeting only served to throw her off balance. Drawing the man to her, she opened a pink bottle with an unknown rose-coloured potion and treated a few drops to the wound on Haider's arm. Suddenly the wound healed, leaving no trace behind. The only reminder of its existence was the glove torn where it had been. The man was amazed, trying to find out what this marvellous potion was, with such a strong effect that no other medicine on the markets had. How useful this potion would be in the offensive. But Armonia flatly refused to speak. She noticed that it was nearing sunset, and as the sun went down, it would be hard for them to get their bearings. So they decided to set out again. The time was getting close to nightfall. The stars shining in the clear sky seemed to whisper to me that I should slow down and rest. Haider rejoiced to Armony that it was only a few days' ride to the capital, if no obstacles got in the way. The man stopped in front of the girl's carriage, holding out his hand to help her down. The self-possessed lady probably didn't even know what the gesture meant, so she didn't pay much attention to it, jumping off the carriage onto the ground unaided. Armonia realized that if one kept running, one would soon see the finish line. She was about to advise the man to go to the side, but noticed that he still had his hand outstretched toward the carriage. Haider was embarrassed, returning the hesitant hand to its previous position, trying to gloss over the situation. It was no longer important to the tired girl, so she headed off to rest, warming up. The man made another attempt to ask the girl about that miraculous potion, trying to learn at least a little. He shared his knowledge that the basis of such potions was the blood of trolls, whose numbers had dwindled in recent years, so the ingredient was rare. Armonia had heard from Karis that there were indeed fewer trolls, for reasons unknown. The man added that the monster hunters know where to find hidden trolls, so they have become a kind of monopoly. However, no one knows how they do it, so they will soon visit them and find out. The plan for the near future was set. She refused to say anything about the potion, even though he tried to press her on their long-standing relationship. Armonia managed to disengage herself from the persistent young man. She left her friends in the carriage, intending to bring them some fruit. The girl went to the carriage, which was loaded with many ripe fruits, intending to drag them to her place. Kun, the guy who always followed the commander, was waiting for her at the wagon, and since he was so close to the Cande, it was dangerous to mess with him. The young man greeted Armonia in a friendly manner, but she didn't even cast a glance in his direction as she walked past, showing reluctance to make contact. Her attempt to open the carriage was interrupted by Kuhn, slamming the door shut with a firm hand and looming over the girl, chiding her for her impoliteness. A greeting would have been enough for him to make way for her, but Armonia was stubborn. Kuhn introduced himself just as affably, trying to connect with the unsociable traveller, but she only pulled her hood more tightly over her head. He was curious to talk to the unusual girl for once, for he had never had the opportunity before. He pointed out the wagon window, noting that the commander himself had picked the fruit for her personally. Slyly rubbing his chin, the young man concluded, which was definitely a sign that he cared a great deal for her. Perhaps the girl was hiding outstanding abilities that would be useful offensively. Kuhn continued his questioning. If she was so strong, why hadn't she been honoured with a crystal badge yet? It turned out that the girl had no idea that such a thing existed. He explained that the crystal mark marked the strongest mercenary, and his distinguishing feature was a sword with a red blade. The boy ostentatiously bared his sword in front of Armonia, showing it to her. Even humans fight within their society for recognition and rank. Kuhn decided to annoy the girl by encouraging her to get such a sign, but it was not in her plans. She was not interested in the class struggle of people. Kuhn became more and more convinced that Armonia was not of their world, even though he had heard of her quirks. The young man cautiously approached the forest of Voltar near the hamlet where the girl had met Haider, assuming it was her home there. Armonia didn't deny it, nervously pulling her hood over her face. The young man smugly continued, stooping down to the traveller's eye level and leaning on his sword. The forest was very familiar to the boy, as he had been there often with his teacher, who had warned him that there were many monsters in the forest. His mentor was nothing but an experienced monster hunter who had taught him a lot of things, replacing his parents. Armonia didn't want to hear the guy's backstory, trying to stop him, but Kuhn, as if not listening, continued his narrative. One day he got lost in the forest, where it was easy to get lost because of its intricacy, not being there for the first time. He found out that the girl had never been lost there. She explained that he must have gone there with a vested interest, which is why the forest had swallowed him up. The boy grinned. What other purpose could a hunter have? The girl's reaction was as violent as if strangers had broken into her home. Kuhn was skillfully hitting Armonia's most vulnerable points, trying to get some information out of her. That day he was helped by a girl of about 10 with sea green hair. In such a deep forest, she was naturally not alone. She was accompanied by a crowd of monsters guarding her. From that day on, her image never left Kuhn's mind. And at one point he noticed that Armonia looked exactly like the little girl from the thicket. With those words, he tried to remove the hood that covered the girl's face. The traveller perkily pushed the guy away, trying to convince him that he was wrong, because she didn't remember anything like that. Besides, her hair colour is quite common, so you shouldn't jump to conclusions. The girl did not want to listen to the young man's nonsense any longer, but turned around and went to her carriage. Kuhn agreed with her. But were there many girls like her on the planet, with mysterious powers to influence monsters? He was now firmly convinced that 10 years ago in the Voltar forest, he had been saved by the woman who stood before him now, Armonia. Kuhn looked insistently into the eyes of the stunned girl, who was struck by lightning. She couldn't say a word. She'd been so easily taken in. Armonia sharply backed away from the boy, forbidding him to approach her. But he didn't want to hurt her at all. He wanted to meet her again at least once. The girl was not at all happy about these words. But the young man was glowing with happiness, realizing that at last, for the first time in 10 years, he could personally introduce himself to his saviour. He thanked her heartily for her help, for without her, he would surely have gotten into trouble. But Armonia was busy thinking that she would rather have left him to his fate that day than suffer the consequences of her good-naturedness now. Her thoughts were written on her face, and Kuhn unmistakably said them aloud, awkwardly asking her if that was what she was thinking. The girl waved it off, but as we had noticed before, the skill of lying was beyond her control. He had hoped that Armonia's opinion of him would change after the conversation, but the truth was more painful to hear than it was to guess. He couldn't understand why the traveler was so hostile to him. The girl had to point out to the guy what seemed to be on the surface. The monster hunter couldn't possibly be her buddy. What's more, he's a valuable member of a punitive operation that's planning its raid into her home forest, intent on wiping out Armonia's family. That was why the traveller was here now. However, her goals were the opposite of Kun's intentions: to stop the raid before it began, which she firmly stated to the young man's face. The fact that he was trying to please her was rather arrogant. The young man wilted before his eyes. He confessed that the only reason he had participated in the raid was to revisit the Voltar forest. But that was not the only way for such a strong and trained man to get there. His words sounded like an outright lie. Kun exhaled, trying to focus and release the tension. He decided to lay all the cards on the table. His real reason for participating in the raid was the thought of the girl being held captive by the monsters. That day, his guide looked sad and lonely in the crowd of monsters surrounding her. He was convinced of his conclusions when he looked for newspaper advertisements for a missing child from an aristocratic family. Armonia listened patiently to the young man, rubbing the tips of her hair lightly with her fingers as she recalled the details being described. Kun decided that a large number of like-minded people would increase his chances of finding the stolen girl and rescuing her. But that evening he realized that all his reasoning had been a profound delusion. Kun flushed, averting his eyes in embarrassment, eager to fall to the ground for the stupid things he'd said. The warrior turned away from the girl, covering his head with his hands in shame. But the girl's thoughts were busy comparing the flushed boy to a boiled octopus. Then Armonia decided to confess, in response to Kun's honesty, that she herself had run away from home into the forest. Her abilities seemed to beckon to the stupefied monsters, and she was always surrounded by them. The only problem was the people who feared their visits like fire. They themselves wanted to get rid of the princess, who, in their opinion, was too dangerous for the whole village. This news was a relief to the young man. He happily tightened the bandage on the back of his head, and smiling warmly, said that since it was Armonia's wish, he could not interfere with it. The traveller looked up at the cordial Kun. He had remembered her for a long time and was concerned for her safety, so she decided to thank her knight. It was her greeting that the young man finally honoured. Kun flushed again, looking at the little girl. He opened the wagon door, letting her inside and covering her embarrassed face. As Armonia climbed into the carriage, the young man tried, though the girl didn't ask, to clear his name more and more, clarifying that his responsibility is only within the villages attacked by monsters. Creatures that happen to meet their way, he never tries to touch. Kun, while Armonia greedily stuffed her hands with fruit, remarked that her goal for stopping the operation was rather difficult, since the authorization had long since been signed. But if that was what she wished, he could try to talk to the Chancellor. This interested the girl so much that she looked out of the carriage, wanting to clarify whether Kun was really so close to Kande. It turned out that he really trusted him, and they were in constant communication. It wasn't easy, but it was worth a try. The important thing was that now Armonia had someone to support her. Kun politely extended his hand to the girl, wanting to help her down. Again that unknown gesture. The traveller snickered that the young man looked too much like Haider, placing an apple in the boy's hand and getting down on her own. It was the ripest-looking fruit, so the girl clarified if she had paid for his favour. The puzzled boy burst out laughing a moment later. He offered Armonia friendship, to which he again received a disapproving glare, and behind showed an annoyed Haider, just heading in the direction of the couple, having heard a little of their casual conversation. Kun persisted in offering Armonia, who was already trying to carry the fruit away on her own, help, citing how heavy it looked to carry it all. The girl who tried to sneak away noticed Haider trying to pretend he wasn't even here. He calmed them both down, saying he was just taking a walk before bed. And while Kun's attention was distracted, Armonia quickly said goodbye to the men and fled to her carriage, leaving the two young men alone. A Haider asked when Kun and Armonia had become so close. The young man proudly announced that as of today, they were officially friends. but it wasn't quite clear why he thought so. Although they seemed different, but in Kuhn's opinion they understood each other well. And besides, they kept a common secret. With these words, the young man left the commander and went to rest. Haider was exhausted from the last few days spent on the road. The fatigue had probably made him more sensitive. He put his palm to his forehead and grimly decided that he was worrying about nothing and that he should go to bed early tonight. Morpheus reigned supreme in Armonia's carriage at this time. Nadium slept peacefully, covered with a blanket, forgetting all about his disguise, which made his ears green again. Only the traveller was not sleepy. Ferry noticed the girl's natural insomnia, for the capital was just a stone's throw away, and sleep could not overpower the troubled Armonie. Her concern was that she had no idea at all what to say to Chancellor Haider when they met. Perhaps she should ask Kander about it, for he would know how to behave with people of high rank. Ferry, however, was not comfortable with the idea. After all, this man had personally agreed to participate in the operation. And it is very dangerous to rush to trust greedy people who use everyone for their own benefit, because Armonie risked being injured. In the current world, it is difficult to understand what is true and what is false, so it is worth being careful. The girl, on the other hand, asked not to worry about her like a child. The helplessness in the absence of the monster's support worried her greatly. Armonia decided that the topic was not worth continuing. Everyone should be well rested now, so that they could move on tomorrow. As she fell asleep, the girl thought about how her life had changed since leaving her native forest. While she had been there, such thoughts had not crossed her mind, but now that she realized her helplessness, she was deeply disappointed. Maybe being in the forest was not something that deserved attention at all, but was it really for her own good? The next morning, the carriages were already actively continuing toward the capital. Even though Armonia had stayed up late, she was feeling pretty good. There was only one problem that annoyed her. It was Kuhn, who had taken the place of the coachman, who had been sent to rest beside her, and was passionately telling something to Armonia, who was letting his endless broadcasts pass her ears. Haider noticed the pale face of the girl, who recognized at once that she was not well. The man asked Kuhn to make less jokes, for Armonie felt uncomfortable in such an environment. The traveller was flattered by such a remark without disturbing her rescue. Kuhn swept his eyes once again to the fact that he would not embarrass his friend, with whom he shared a common secret. And the commander himself was not much different from him. Armonia plugged her ears and tried to urge the young men to stop fighting, as her head was buzzing without their nonsensical remarks. But the girl had picked up on being in the company of two people close to the Chancellor. It was a great chance to get information about him in advance. She asked Kuhn to tell her about Haider's weaknesses, which made the young man hesitate a little. The situation was getting tenser and tenser. Haider clutched the reins, hoping for Kuhn's discretion, who had taken a wrong turn. When he stopped the carriage, he asked if the girl really needed to go to the capital to meet the Chancellor. Armonia confidently replied that it was true, because that was the only way she would meet him in person and be able to talk. It seemed that she didn't even suspect anything. Haider called out to Kuhn in a panic, waving his palm and urging him to stop, for he was risking all his future plans now. But the young man was not going to listen. He had known of the way to meet the Honourable Chancellor much earlier. He said that the man she was looking for was right across the street from her. The end of the long lie came suddenly. Armonia froze as if doused with ice water. Kuhn had thought the girl had simply made up an affectionate nickname for the Chancellor, but it turned out that she had been deftly tricked. With a cold and piercing stare, Armonia turned to Haider, who had no chance for an excuse. Armonia demanded that Haider say something, but he guiltily kept silent, not knowing where to begin. Kuhn realized that he had seriously blundered in thinking that Kande was a cute nickname, and tried to speak to Armonia, but the latter rightly said that without his mistake, she would have been in the dark all the way to the capital. The Chancellor began by saying that he was indeed guilty before the girl, but that he was not unreasonably deceived. He held a highly paid, respected position, which caused him to constantly fall for the tricks of dishonest people. He was attacked either because of his status or because of his money. And from the very beginning of their journey, When Armonia had clearly pointed him out, wanting to talk about something important, he decided to be cautious and vigilant, for he was risking his life. Armonia was furious. All this time, even when Haider had asked her about the potion ingredients, he had been relying on their trust. The girl had no burning desire to help his squad by correcting their stupid mistakes. But even with all her dislike, she stayed, wanting to fulfill her promise. But just as important was the fact that Haider had always relied on her. The commander had a strong detachment at his disposal, with which he could just as safely reach the capital. And yet, every time Armonia went missing, he strove to find her at all costs. All the people she had met before on her path were either trying to use her or kill her. But after seeing the side of Kande with completely opposite values, she stopped hating him like the others. Armonia still stayed with him because she was comforting herself with the thought of being trusted, but she was blind. All this time she was considered capable of betrayal, which hurt her feelings. The man tried to say something in his own defense, but felt that the best thing to do now would be to remain silent. He stared sullenly at the road, blinded by the dreary downpour that had come at such a bad time. The cold rain sprinkled the thoughtful travellers. There was a silence that meant something different to each of them. Armonia could not blame Haider for his secrecy, for she herself had not told him much about herself. She could not understand why the same act had hurt her. Ferry was right. People are fickle, and the boundaries of truth and falsehood are blurred in different ways for them. It was even more painful to realise that than it had been to hear it before. Involuntarily, Armonia compared the gloomy Haider to a summer full of greenery and frequent rain falling from the heavy clouds that filled the heavens. This summer consumed her, making her forget the passage of time and abandon her goals. She had only herself to blame for everything that had happened. The squad arrived at the high, massive walls of the capital. Armonia lifted the hood over her eyes, unable to believe her eyes. Haider began to go through the formalities at the entrance, showing his pass. The girl could not yet fully realise that she was the one she wanted to find, Mr. Chancellor, as the guards addressed him. The man offered the girl a residence in the capital, where she could rest after a long, tiring journey. But the girl refused at once, claiming that she still had money left for a hotel, and she had no intention of contacting Haider again. He respected the decision of Armonia, who now had every right to do so. The man could no longer hold her back, but still asked if there was anything she wanted to say to him before parting. Not to his unknown Chancellor Haider, but to Kanda. The girl exclaimed confidently that he would no longer deceive others before their very eyes, hurling the ridiculous insult already familiar to us. Haider was taken aback, still not sure how to react to the unfortunate troll booger, but tried to explain himself about his deception as he suddenly saw Armoni's hand outstretched. She probably finally realised what the gesture meant, because Haider took her hand, helping her down. But it was a mistake. The girl jerked her hand away contemptuously, recalling that the man had promised to give her a document, allowing her to meet the Chancellor in person when she arrived in the capital. Haider awkwardly handed it to her, not realising the need for it, since he himself was right in front of her. But Armonia said she needed time to recover and think things over. And then the girl descended from the carriage, making an appointment to meet Haider exactly 1 week later, asking to make time for her. Then the fate of their future journey would be decided. Armonia set out on her journey. A few minutes later, she was called back by the voice of Kuhn, who had caught up with her. He anxiously shared a thought he'd been thinking about for some time. The young man was genuinely worried about Armonia. He thought it would be safer for her to be among humans. Of course, he couldn't oppose her decision, but he asked her to weigh it carefully. The young man harboured warm hopes that she would listen to him. At that moment, he was called out by one of the warriors. It was time to go back. Haider's right hand had heard that Armonia would be back in a week, so he didn't say goodbye to his friend at all. Waving his hand, the boy ran away. The girl was left alone with her thoughts. Looking after her friend, she didn't understand why people were so stubborn, and didn't recognise that they could coexist with monsters on the same land. Armonia chided herself for not even being around humans for long enough to succumb to their influence. The closer she was to the human world, the farther she got away from the monsters. Armonia set off on her journey. After a while, the girl arrived at an inn with the fanciful name, the Hut with Songs of the Night. Armonia quietly reasoned aloud that the choice was somewhat strange. A golden-haired girl who worked here interrupted her musings, appearing out of nowhere and startling the traveller, who bounced away from her like a scaredy cat. The worker said that Armonia was not the first to think so. The girl explained that the name of this inn was given by the previous owner, who was related to her wizard friend. It sounded quite plausible, because the lodging house was of an old model, and for all her time of work, there had never been repaired. The traveller reflected on the fact that it was for the best, as wizards probably liked abstract things like monsters. The worker, having finished her narrative, invited Armonia inside, apologising for the long wait. She led her guest inside, asking if she had come for a night's lodging or an errand. Armonia was going to stay here, but this was the first time she had heard about errands. It turned out that this was the place from which monster hunters could receive errands. Among those errands were conquering monsters, hunting, and gathering the necessary resources in the forests. The girl hesitated, but decided to ignore it. She mumbled that she would stay for about a week until she spotted a sign with familiar symbols. Armonia grabbed it and read it aloud in a slurred voice, attracting the attention of the man behind her. The employee blurted out the stranger's name. The man with the bright eyes and atypical green hair was a viscount bearing the surname Knight. He approached Armonia to meet the stranger who interested him. The girl brushed off talking to herself, but Viscount knew full well it wasn't true. He blocked the startled Armony's path, hovering over her shoulder. He clarified, looking directly into her eyes, that this language was impossible for a normal human to read. These symbols were only understood by monsters. The Viscount concluded that an important guest had arrived whom he must treat. Ignoring Armonia's refusals, he asked the golden-haired woman to prepare their food and invited the traveller to his chambers for the upcoming conversation, not suitable for the dining room. Being within the spacious and bright walls, Armonia wondered why all the capital's residents were so stubborn, just like Haider and Kuhn. Over an appetizing dish, the man introduced himself. His name was Rack Knight. Armonia also did not refuse the courtesy of giving her name. The man decided to get right to the point, which was the reason he had so hastily dragged the newly arrived traveller to his room. He needed to know what she had read on that plaque. Though Armonia continued to deny her knowledge, covering herself by talking to herself, Rack skillfully pressed the right points. Since she didn't want to confess openly, her buddies hiding in the bag could probably do it. The girl froze in agonizing fear. No one had ever exposed her so quickly. Rack went on to explain that these symbols could not be interpreted by experienced researchers, nor could they be interpreted by isolated ethnic groups. There was nothing stopping him from bringing the monsters here, but why couldn't Armony let him know the contents of what was written as well? The Viscount waited with a sinister smile for an answer from his victim. It hit Armonia. As she answered in a trembling voice, she realized that the man was emanating the energy of a lamia, a monster that looked like a huge snake with dark green scales. There was no point in hiding any longer, and the girl replied that the plaque said, "May your favorite nest be eternal." Raker was satisfied with this unexpected answer. His expression became friendlier than before. Now it was Armonia's turn to find out who was sitting in front of her. Completely placated, the man replied that he was as much an ordinary human as he was an ordinary monster. The girl scrutinized the scales on Rack's neck, recognizing her inattention. It confused her that her opponent was close to human. In front of her was a member of a race mixed with monsters and humans. According to the stories, the man's grandmother was a non-human, and his grandfather was a normal human, so he had mixed blood. And judging from the fact that Armonia carries monsters with her in her bag, she wasn't exactly ordinary either. The girl decided that since this man was connected to the monster world, he could probably be a support for her. She revealed her plans to stop the raid on her home forest. Rack flatly denied that it was impossible. Though he didn't know why Armonia would do such a dangerous thing, for her own safety, it would be worth it to get off the thorny path. The Viscount stood up and approached the girl, continuing to make arguments that put her in an increasingly vulnerable position. Earlier raids on the Volta forest had been carried out by warriors, but had failed miserably each time. This time the imperial court was determined, but this time Rack was confident of a human victory. The viscount was confident in his observations, and even if it was Armonia's sincere decision, he considered it only a waste of time. Rack continued to pile on in apparent pleasure as Lime popped out of the traveller's bag, punched the scoundrel right in the stomach, and bounced back. Armonia, not expecting such a prank, and the disgruntled Slime, sitting in his dear friend's arms, exclaimed that he couldn't help but help her, watching her get into trouble. He also smelled that Cancer smelled like a monster, even though he looked human. Ferry resented him for making up things that he couldn't do, because he had no nose. Slime was getting out of it that he could fumble for it. Armonia asked her friends not to quarrel, and the Viscount stood in amazement. He could not believe his ears, for the girl understood her travelling companions perfectly. Armonia cut off with a bored look that it was obvious she was capable of understanding their speech, for otherwise she would not have read the inscription on the plaque. Rack was stumped. His beliefs seemed to crumble in a moment at the realization that humans could learn this language. Armonia confirmed that people could do a lot of things if they wanted to. She had long ago realized the biggest difference between humans and monsters. Namely that monsters tend to be constant, while humans tend to search for new things and explore the unknown. That's why they evolve so much faster than monsters. And maybe that's why she's been able to get this far. Armonia told at her own risk what she would never dare tell anyone. There are dragons in the Volta forest. They are the only creatures capable of controlling nature, and destroying where they dwelled was reckless. The girl continued that dragons were not interested in meddling in the affairs of humans and were usually inactive. But since the humans had prepared themselves this time, he wouldn't stay away either. A smile reappeared on Rack's face that did not bode well. He agreed that fighting a dragon would be dangerous, but only if it really existed. The Viscount referred to the many studies on monsters that didn't mention such rare creatures. Unlike monsters as uncommon and secretive as trolls, whose blood is still used to make potions, dragons leave no trace of their presence at all to be found. Consequently, their existence cannot be proven. Armonia concluded that judging from Rack's words, he fully accepted the people's position and supported the raid. But the Viscount corrected her thoughts, for he remained neutral and was drawing conclusions solely from his observations. Armonia held a pause. She knew that Lamias were long-lived, so the man in front of her could be much older than he looked. The girl finally spoke. People seemed ridiculous to her. Every time she gave them a chance to choose, they found themselves in a situation they always regretted. And Rack would make sure that humanity would also regret this raid, perhaps even before entering the lands of the forest. Armonia, approaching the exit of the chambers, also advised not to spread this conversation, or she would not be able to stay away. The Viscount found himself in the same position in which he wanted to put the fragile girl as well. Did Cancer consider his race a great disadvantage? The answer he probably already knew himself. With those words, leaving only more questions, Armonia left the room. Already in her room, she was sharing her thoughts with her friends. Initially, she had been prepared to fight with the Viscount, but she realized that even with the dragon on their side, great damage was not impossible. Her friends were in agreement with her. The girl also realized that if the humans discovered Karis, they would hunt him down as well, and all with the purpose of obtaining expensive materials from his body. Lime hoped that Rack would side with them, for he had seen mixed-race people before. It was surprising to Armonia that they'd encountered one before. Ferry, on the other hand, told me that mixed-race people were common in the past, but humans, with thoughts of how vile these hybrids were, exterminated most of them. The survivors now either hide or live like that among humans. These were frightening events that still, for some reason, didn't change Cancer's mind. Well, it was already his own decision. Armonia was going to talk to Haider in a week, and if the negotiations failed, she would have to take the head of the Drakes and retreat. She remembered her promise, but still something made her think she had forgotten something. The girl looked at her hand, which had felt empty for a long time. From Ferry's observation, all the things were in place. And then a cold sweat broke out on Armonia's forehead. She realized that her hand had always been occupied with another hand. She had completely forgotten about Nadiam, whom she had last seen sleeping peacefully in the carriage. Armonia's soul went to her heels, and she stood motionless for a while, lifting the hand with which she held the spirit. The girl clutched her head, panicking over where she might have left it. At the same time, she blamed herself for such carelessness. Finally, she remembered that the carriages had gone straight to the imperial palace. Armonia decided that it would be better and quicker to leave her friends in the room, and herself try to get behind the guarded walls of the palace as soon as possible. After all, if Nadiam wakes up, due to his nature, he will not stay put. And before he speaks to unsuspecting people in the language of monsters, it is necessary to get him as soon as possible. With these thoughts, the girl ran out of her chambers outside. Making her way through the shopping streets and crowds of people, Armonia, out of breath, reached the main gate. The entrance looked impassable. Candy was right when he described all the complicated procedures to get in. It was fortunate that the girl had picked up the entrance permit in time, but when she reached for it, she found that she had left her bag at the inn along with the monsters. Today was clearly not her day. And why is she so absent-minded? Armonia covered her face with her hand, ashamed of herself. Still, it was worth it to at least try to talk to the guards rather than waste time coming back. The girl approached one of the men on duty. She told that she had urgent business outside the walls, so she needed to get there for a few minutes. But the guard counted no words nonsense and sent away, noting that this is not a passing yard. Armonia persisted in her pleas to be let in, gesticulating erratically with her hands. She said that her friend was there, to which the guard, already irritated by her nonsensical arguments, reported that they were carefully guarding the place, so no one could just walk in. The girl persisted. She insisted that she be allowed to see the carriages that had recently arrived here, and if that was not possible, then let them pass her words to Chancellor Haider, or at least to Kuhn. They would surely understand what she was saying. Armonia's entreaties were interrupted by a spear held to her throat by the watchman, angered by such cavalier speech. Under the advice of his partner to be more civil, he demanded the girl's departure. The guard seemed to come to his senses. However, Armonia brought the situation to the point of absurdity by calling him her trademark meaningless insult. The guard flared up, intending to argue with the girl, but suddenly he was interrupted by the calm voice of an unidentified man. The girl turned around. Behind her stood a man in glasses and a light-coloured long robe, whom the guards addressed as Archmage Rusna. The man addressed the traveller personally, asking why she needed such important people. Armonia firmly reiterated that she was looking for her friend, who was now inside the walls. She mentioned that she had previously been a member of the punishment squad and knew everyone personally, but the guard persisted that she was a liar and she'd better not utter the Chancellor's name in vain. Rusna stopped this childish squabble by taking responsibility for the girl, intending to help her find her lost boy. He knew exactly where the carriages were parked, so he could easily tell her. Now the two of them went inside unhindered. On the way to the carriage, Armonia eyed her saviour, wondering why the archmage would help her with such a ridiculous request. But the question was clear on her face. The good-natured-looking man pointed it out, smiling warmly. The girl was confused again, groping her face and trying to figure out what it was that she kept seeing there. Rusna asked to be called by his first name for convenience, even though others addressed him by his title. He explained that a premonition told him that he should not ignore the situation. He called it a premonition, something he had gotten when he reached archmage level, a special instinct of whether a person was lying or was the right person for him. And naturally, he had his own sources of information, which made it easier to explain everything that had happened. Obviously, the archmage was close to the Chancellor, but the latter preferred to keep it a secret. It turned out that Rusna often received letters from Haider, in which the latter often mentioned his marvellous guide. And such a person was the one Haider wanted to see in his team. The most interesting part was just beginning. Rusna led Armonia to the carriages. The girl remembered riding in one of the first carriages, but such a number confused her. Then the archmage offered to examine them one by one. It would take a long time, and the girl asked him if there was any search magic, embarrassing her guide. There probably really wasn't any. The voices of familiar knights could be heard discussing the silent child found in the carriage. It hit Armonia, and she ran with all her might to apologize to Nadium, who was distraught at being left so easily. The girl gently took the spirit's hand, promising it would never happen again. After some thought, Nadium turned away embarrassed, saying that out of his generosity he would forgive her, but only once. What a relief. One of the knights that found the spirit was the one who had attacked Armonia during the argument about the ogres. She didn't want to mess with him again, so she limited her response to his questions to the fact that the child was with her, and she would take him now. Armonia was relieved to thank Rusna for his assistance, for she would hardly have been let in so easily without him. While the archmage was offering to help Armonia to the gate, the second knight was encouraging the guilty party to apologize for his past outburst at the traveller. Armonia was about to leave, but the attacking knight called out to her, asking if she really didn't want to participate in the suppression. The girl paused, looking at the boy in disgust. With disgust. Knight counts her decision as shameful, for with her forces this raid could have ended much faster, which was beneficial to humanity. Then all the inhabitants could go about their daily routine comfortably and safely. Moreover, if the raid was successful, the Emperor would not ignore Armonia's merits, lavishing her with wealth that would last the rest of her life. In addition, she would probably receive a title much more prestigious than a crystal mark like Kun's. In short, a great chance to build a happy life for herself in society. Armonia was boiling before his eyes. Rusna sensed it and tried to postpone the conversation, but the girl beat him to it with a question about why people cared so much about their situation. She said that the only reason she had followed them was because of the treaty with Chancellor Haider, which was finalized upon her arrival in the capital. She wasn't interested in wealth and status. The girl turned around and looked at the knight disdainfully and walked arm in arm with Nadium towards the exit. Rusna stared at the girl, who was as if from another planet. Few people would turn down the opportunity to become famous and make a good living. The knight overtook the girl, blocking her path and continuing to pester her with questions. Since she doesn't need wealth and status, why doesn't she help people out of the goodness of her heart? After all, the disappearance of the monsters would only bring happiness to everyone. Armonia, lightly squeezing Nadium's hand in annoyance, asked a counter-question. Was he sure that everyone would be happy? If that happens, the forest will eventually die, for the living have no place on a dying earth. And for all those souls, the people who allowed this to happen will bear the burden. The knight didn't understand at all how monsters were connected to the forest, to which Armonia mocked his ignorance. She told him not to impose his will on others, for blindly and smugly judging that they were acting for their own happiness was sure to hurt someone else. It was obvious that the knight saw the girl's love for monsters, but the archmage, who stopped the action, did not allow her to find out the reason for such affection. He strongly advised against discussing such topics within the palace walls, and on his face he read that it would be better for the boy to listen to him. Armonia headed for the gate again, holding back her irritation. The fact that Rusna had called out to her was the last straw, and the girl turned to him with irritation. The archmage apologized for his insistence, but curiosity to find out if Armonia really liked monsters won out. The girl, after some thought, felt that she had no reason to answer him and said that she had to go long ago. Rusna did not insist and said he would certainly see her next time, in a week's time. Disappearing in print, the archmage said goodbye to Armonia, mentioning her name, and the girl was left in agonizing speculation, staring at the empty spot where Rusna had just stood, realizing that she had not introduced herself to him or told him of her plans. How then could he know? Her nervous musings were interrupted by Nadium, who realized on his own skin the need to learn the human language better, for this situation could happen again. Haider, who had spotted the travellers from the study window, watched their departure. Rusna, who had already disappeared, was with him, confirming what the Chancellor had said in his letter, that Armonia was a great man and a dangerous opponent. If Haider was to achieve his goals, he would have to work harder. Haider was in agreement that he would have a hard time in the future, exhaling heavily and seeing Armonia off with a glance. Rusna, on the other hand, with his constant smile, remarked that he immediately picked up on the reason why the Chancellor was so greedy. The girl was special, quite unlike the others. She had no goal of gaining untold riches or unquestioned power, and all her thoughts and decisions were clearly stated. This is probably the essence of her power. Besides, her knowledge of monsters is astonishingly good and deep, but judging from her notations to the knight, she originally had no intention of participating in the suppression. What would the Chancellor do in such a position? Haider did not understand what Rusna was getting at. The latter wondered if the commander would then allow him to participate in the attack. Whether the girl would follow Haider or not, the Chancellor would surely want to use all his opportunities for success. Haider defiantly pushed back his chair, sitting down on it, indicating that he would take care of it himself, and Rusna should do his job. And even if Armonia came to him in the future, Haider ordered the archmage not to go near her in any way. Rusna raised his hands in concession to the Chancellor. He realized that he had offended him with his proposal, and if someone who might have been nearby heard it, he might think that Rusna had done something rash. But the archmage wanted to give advice to the Chancellor, who was so desperate to get the girl. Rusna bowed to Haider, promising to obey his words, and headed for the exit, surprising the guards standing outside with his sudden appearance. The Chancellor thought deeply. The mages were too perceptive, for Rusna had realized at once that Haider intended to attract Armonia, who was already interested in him. He would not give up so easily. In addition, Haider had stumbled upon an old appeal that had come to him 17 years ago. It was a letter from the Duke of Felborn, begging the head of the family to find her stolen child. At that time, parchments about the missing girl had been posted everywhere, terrifying every passerby. Now it is one of the many forgotten incidents of the past. Many thought the girl was long dead, but what if she did manage to survive? This duchy is worth learning more about. And so the decisive day came. Armonia confidently gathered herself for the meeting with the Chancellor, which she had been expecting for a week. She had brought her entry permit and a dagger in case she encountered another troll-like creature. Lime, who had just awakened, noticed that the girl was already on her way. He'd offered her breakfast before he left, but she'd decided that coming early would save time. She also needed to settle the matter with Drake. Then Lime offered to go together, but the girl had to refuse him. The guards at the entrance were very serious, and if they were spotted together, there would be serious problems. So she told the slime to take care of Ferry and Nadium, and went to negotiate. While Armonia was escorted to Haider's office, she surveyed her surroundings. The building looked imposing, and it was no surprise that special permission was needed. The lady guard escorted Armonia to the office door. She began to explain that the Chancellor had no outside schedule right now, so he was inside. Armonia, however, unceremoniously opened the door and began calling Haider by name, announcing her arrival. What was her surprise when she saw the already familiar Rack in the office with the puzzled Chancellor, talking to Haider about some red beans and a contract that needed to be fixed. The Chancellor, rubbing his forehead with his hand, ordered the carriage to be prepared. It was obvious he was going somewhere. Armonia gave Rack a glance, wondering if the two knew each other. And what kind of contract were they talking about? What about the promise she'd made to her a week earlier? The girl was furious. Haider should have explained himself at once. He confessed that he had tried his best to keep his word, but unforeseen circumstances had arisen that required an immediate solution. The Chancellor had already mentioned a place that sold potions exclusively. There he decided to make a large purchase of suppression potions. But there were misunderstandings even on the terms of the concluded contract, so Haider has to go now. Today was not a good day at all, so the Chancellor suggested contacting the girl again. Armonia thought for a moment. Even though it was extremely difficult to obtain troll blood, people continued to make potions. And since the order was quite large, the number of trolls being sacrificed must be large. But how did they get such resources? Haider waited for the girl's reply. The traveller, after thinking for a moment, replied that there was no need to contact her, because she would go with the Chancellor together. She needed to know the details of this suspicious contract. Haider was surprised by this decision, for Armonia must have hated such places, and here she was about to go straight there. The girl explained that this was true, but she wondered how the potions continued to be made if the troll population was declining so rapidly. Armonia snickered at the thought that it would be wonderful if monsters were no longer sacrificed, but apparently that was impossible. Because of the need for resources, trolls were being killed indiscriminately, so there might not be any left in the near future. Despondency has been replaced by anger. People are so hypocritical. They protect the animals so reverently, and they didn't care about the monsters at all. Haider noticed the girl's anger. He was still surprised at how quickly her mood changed. He tried to reassure the girl that he would take her with him, and they would leave now to save time. The viscount must have already prepared the carriage. Armonia stopped Haider by the arm, asking if he had been friends with the green-haired guy for a long time. The man replied that their relationship was strictly business. Viscount Knight is the representative of the merchant who agreed to assist in the extermination. That's why they communicate. The girl was disappointed. Even with the argument that cancer remained neutral, he still helped people, probably intending to blend into their society. That was tantamount to messing around with destroy spruce monsters. Armonia let go of Haider's hand. No matter how much monster blood was in Rak's body, he had already chosen his path. Therefore, she shouldn't worry about it. The trio arrived at a castle, somewhat smaller than the Emperor's, but also of impressive size, which also had an underground factory. Armonia looked down at the massive building from top to bottom, shielding her eyes from the sun with the palm of her hand. It would be rash not to notice that this factory was a real monopoly. The factory was a real monopoly, and from the very morning, there were long lines of people waiting to buy expensive potions. Haider left Rak and Armonia alone, going to make arrangements with the guards, and the Viscount whispered to Armonia that he could see her pretending not to know him. The traveller cut off that she wasn't going to talk to liars. She heatedly began to reprimand Rak's contradictory choice of words. He could talk to people in peace, but why did his choice fall on the Chancellor? Armonia almost blurted out about Hyde's fear and hatred of monsters, but remembered in time that she had promised to keep it a secret. Now she felt ridiculous for her inability to follow through with the thought. The Chancellor had just returned to the end of the conversation, informing them that they would be escorted to the head of the house. He noticed the tension between his two companions and decided to ask what had happened. Armonia frowned and said only that she didn't want to talk to Rak because of the irritation he was causing in her. She walked briskly to the entrance of the building, trying to avoid an awkward conversation. Haider asked the Viscount if they had quarrelled. Rak calmly answered him that it was unacceptable. If it suddenly happened, they would be in big trouble. He carefully watches his words so as not to offend her. Rak's reply only reinforced the Chancellor's confidence that Armonia was full of secrets. The company went into the underground corridors, which were no different from a normal building, except for the lack of windows. The girl marvelled at every detail, for the place was underground, but so different from Nadiam's domain. As soon as the travellers arrived at the master's study, the ground shook violently, and the girl staggered. Haider, carefully holding Armonia, pressed against him. Usually the girl was good at keeping her balance, but this moment was an exception. The girl who accompanied them explained that earthquakes happen quite often, because the building is quite deep. But there is no need to worry at all, because even in such danger, the wizard working in the store regularly inspects everything. A restless thought flashed through Armonia's mind. Even if there is a wizard here in charge of the building's safety, and the ground is still shaking like this, isn't there something more serious going on from something more serious than simple shaking? The attendant let the company into the master's study, informing him of their arrival. Armonia, stunned by the pungent odour in the room, covered her nose with the back of her hand. Such a noxious odour gave her a headache. The factory owner thanked the Chancellor for the personal visit, as he was unable to visit him due to his circumstances. This was the first time that a merchant had been able to introduce himself in more than just a letter. A wheelchair pulled up in front of the travellers, in which sat an unpleasant-looking man with a dense build that made the buttons on his belly part from the strain. The owner of the House of Red Potion, introduced himself as Magani Redbin. Chancellor exchanged pleasantries with Magani and introduced Viscount Knight as the man who had agreed to support the suppression. Armonia, on the other hand, firmly introduced herself. The landlord laughed and invited everyone to sit down. First of all, he wondered why Haider had decided to visit him in person. Then the Chancellor told them that he thought it was necessary to find out why the terms of the contract had changed so drastically. Earlier, it had been agreed that the store would supply 200 potions, but the actual amount of product had been halved. Magani, fiddling with the rings on his thick fingers, said regretfully and explained that they were currently making losses due to the small amount of material, so due to the limited production, they couldn't produce more. Haider tried to bargain for at least 150 units, but Armonia slapped her palm on the table, indicating that she wanted to ask a question. She didn't hesitate to ask where the factory was getting the troll blood from, if the troll population had dropped dramatically. Haider tried to sit the restless girl down, but Magani calmly responded. He had to make an effort to continue making potions. It wasn't without the help of the aristocracy. However, seeing would be much better than just hearing, so the host invited his guest to take a look at the production facility. Haider whispered to the girl that she should have warned him before committing such antics. Armonia, however, agreed with him peacefully, promising to do so next time. She touched Haider's shoulder gently, heading off to follow the stroller. The man lightly touched the spot where Armonia's hand had been, glancing back at her. The company descended into the dungeon. The workshop didn't look like a place where anything of value was created. It looked more like a dungeon than a serious enterprise. The same foul odour that troubled Armonia was everywhere. A cry reached the girl, begging to be killed. The girl trembled, as if anticipating what she was about to see in front of her. It wasn't just the girl who heard the sounds, but the master assured her that there was nothing to worry about. Haider worriedly inquired about the condition of the girl, whose nerves were about to drive her insane. And even though Armonia pretended as if nothing was happening, Haider offered her his hand, urging her not to be stubborn and to rely on him. This time the girl accepted the man's offer, taking his hand gently and continuing on her way. The door opened, revealing a horrific scene behind it that explained how the potions had not yet gone out of production. Armonia froze in mute shock, marvelling at the cruelty and greed of people who would squeeze the freedom of others without a second thought. And now it caused disgust as well. The girl let go of Haider's hand, running up to the cage and grabbing the wooden partitions. Inside were innocent troll cubs, covered in deep wounds. Their eyes were full of sadness and despair. They smelled the sweet scent of Armonia. When the little trolls saw the human, they thought she had come to spill their blood too. Tears rolled down the traveller's cheeks. She was truly horrified by what she saw. Behind her, she could hear Haider trying to comfort her, and her master laughing at her sentimentality. The master rattled the keys to the dungeon, saying that there was no need to pity the material at all. These creatures were not worthy of a good life, he said, and this way they would be useful to people for the rest of their lives. Armonia could no longer tolerate this disgusting sight. She sincerely regretted that she had not been able to find these children sooner. She deftly pulled the prepared blade from her pouch and took the dungeon keys from Magani's hands. Pointing her blade at her opponents, Armonia prepared to fight. With tears in her eyes, full of anger, she vowed to do whatever it took to save all the poor monsters imprisoned in this cursed place. Armonia approached the cage, accompanied by the stares of her astonished companions. Her master ordered her to stop, to which the girl blurted out not to say a word. She was on the verge of snapping and stabbing the fat man, so it was in his best interest to keep quiet. Magani ordered his guard to seize the criminal, but Chancellor Haider suddenly covered the girl, threatening that he would not stand idly by if she was touched with even a finger. The fat man was furious. He threatened that it was not at all profitable for Haider to confront him now, and how could he do that when he saw such behaviour? Magani's guard managed to get a good look at the girl when her hood fell off. He recognised the one that had been rumoured in the settlements, the blonde-haired maiden who favoured monsters. He reported it to his master, noting that he found too many similarities. Haider was at a loss as to what to do next. The factory owner asked if the Chancellor had picked up the girl in the Voltaire forest. Haider countered that he hadn't picked her up at all. She was a colleague whom he had met at a place other than the one mentioned. It was obvious that the rumours about this girl were true. The commander was stalling for time as best he could, glancing nervously at Armonia, who was hurrying to open the tight lock. Haider argued indignantly that it had nothing to do with Megani, but the factory owner wouldn't let it go. It was clear that with Armonia's abilities, the Chancellor's plan would be over in a flash. And the people would not have to limit themselves to the Voltaire forest alone. It was about the entire world, where there would be no more monsters left, and the resources stored under the supervision of these creatures would become available to their empire. So why not utilize this maiden's abilities to the limit? The fatso advised holding Armonia by force, lest she run away from him. Haider, however, was shocked to see his convictions slowly crumbling. He had definitely come up with a plan to keep Armonia around, for with her help, he could create a perfect safe world for humans without monsters. His thoughts were the same as Redbin's. But why then, instead of understanding, did the Chancellor feel disgust and anger? And what was his opinion of the fragile Armonia until now? At that moment, the traveller overcame the lock with trembling hands and flew into the cage of the imprisoned trolls. Redbin waited for the opportunity to see for himself what she could do, so he did not interfere with her plan to save the children. Armonia crouched down on her knee in front of the trolls, warning them that she was on their side. Though the cubs were surprised that the humans spoke their language, they didn't understand why the girl was helping them. The children looked exhausted, and there was not a single living spot on their bodies. In such a state, they would be caught right away. Therefore, Armonia had no choice but to use her strength. The girl brought the blade to her palm, and overcome with pain, cut it. The blood dripping from her limb miraculously healed the little ones and gave them strength in an instant. Now all that was left was to break down the wall and get out. The monstrosities easily cleared the obstacle and began to run away. The guard didn't understand why Redbin wouldn't stop them, but he already had an ingenious plan that would not overshadow this pathetic escape. Megani realized that with this girl's abilities, he could have all the wealth of this empire in his hands, as he would have access to new materials and resources that people could only hear about before. With these self-serving thoughts, he began blackmailing the commander. Armonia was guilty of stealing and damaging his property, and therefore her life now belonged to him, not the emperor. With a greedy smile on his face, he ordered the guards to catch the rogue. Haider, frowning, stood in front of the girl, not allowing anyone to approach her. He stated firmly that Armonia was his colleague and did not exist to satisfy Redbin's personal interests at all, and therefore the girl was protected. The Chancellor, having finished his speech, drew his sword, pointing it at his opponents and prepared for defence. Haider stood firmly in front of the girl, covering her with himself. There was no point in trying to reason with the Chancellor and win her over to his side. The man threatened that Redbin would now have to be held responsible for breaking the law. The rules did not apply to his factory before Haider became aware that Megani was breeding monsters on his property. According to the law, all activities that could bring danger to the public required the Emperor's approval. So Redbin had to be diligent until the Chancellor's verdict. Megani wrung his hands and tried to explain himself. It turned out that one day a stranger came to him and told him that he knew where to find trolls and how to use them to make potions. The factory owner was dazzled by the possibility of not needing anything and having fun for the rest of his life, but he never thought he would run into trouble with the law. Armonia began to frantically think of someone she might have heard of before. She tried to ask Redbin about the unknown man, but Haider interrupted her, saying that they would hear about it in detail in the imperial palace, in front of witnesses. Viscount Knight was soon to come for the master of the factory, so Redbin had no choice but to follow him. The fat man was cornered, but he obediently complied with the Chancellor's terms. Haider also added that referring to Armonia as that woman was totally unacceptable. He invited her to follow him, calling her by name, and then suddenly said something that made the girl stiffen. Haider addressed her as Princess Felborn. Armonia and Haider rushed by carriage to the place of interrogation. The girl could not even guess how the Chancellor could have known of her origins. But the man claimed that the answer had come to him rather quickly. He remembered the story of a missing 5-year-old child from a duchy favoured by monsters, and the only one who fit the description, the one who looked 22 and could escape unharmed from the clutches of even the most dangerous monsters, was Armonia. The traveller realised that Haider had heard of her before, but the story was similar to Candy's. The Chancellor had only recently learned that the missing girl was Armonia. The girl concluded that here was the reason why Haider had kept her under contract revealed. He wanted to use her in suppression, but the man paused the discussion, saying he would talk to her a little later about it. And now he wished to reunite the Fellborn family and inform the girl's father that he had found her. Armonia did not like the idea. Even after so many years apart, she didn't seem to miss her home in the duchy at all. Haider couldn't understand why the girl was so adamant. She couldn't be with the monsters forever, for he, like Kuhn, believed that humans belonged only among humans. He didn't know the reason why Armonia was so attached to the monsters, but the girl immediately admitted that the creatures of the Voltar forest were now true family to her. And the people of the duchy only pretended to be looking for her, avoiding the disapproval of the public. In fact, they would hardly be happy to see her, and she could not survive in their family. Haider objected, but received a curt reply. Armonia wondered if he, the Chancellor, could leave the human world and live with monsters if he were in her place. The bloody picture from his childhood flashed before Haider's eyes again, and he covered his face with his hand, recognizing that it was impossible for him to do so. Armonia was in the same position. Besides, she realized that she was unlikely to be able to stop the raid, but the girl crosses herself every day to understand the nature of people, so she hoped for reciprocity. The man hesitated and decided to defer this conversation to the palace. Armonia sank down. It became clear that he had not even considered her story before, like the others. Still, she hoped that Kande would understand her. After all, he, like her, is a human being. It was deep night, and while all the castle visitors were already watching their 7th sleep, Haider was gazing pensively at the night sky, full of stars and illuminated by the moon. In his hands was the letter he was going to send to the Duke. Despite Armonia's disagreement, she needed to know what would be for her own good. Haider informed the Duke of Fellborn in a letter sent through Viscount Knight that after an agonizingly long time, he had found his daughter, Princess Fellborn. The Chancellor also made an appointment to meet the Duke at the Imperial Palace, intending to tell him something important. And so the day came on, which Haider waited, looking out of the window, for the carriage with Armonia's father. The Duke arrived at the castle and sat in the reception room, waiting for the person who had sent him the letter that had kept him awake at night. Haider entered Fellborn's room, and after exchanging pleasantries with him, sat down opposite him. The Duke was troubled, and now and then anxiously ran his fingers over his hands. Any parent would be uneasy at being told, after all these years, that their child had been found. Haider announced that he had indeed found the princess, making Fellborn even more worried about her condition. The Chancellor assured him that he understood his guest's feelings, so he also reported that Armonia was unharmed. Haider suggested they meet today, but warned that today's princess might be different from how the Duke remembered her. The Chancellor spoke of her way of thinking, which was radically different from that of humans, and of her favouritism toward monsters. Fellborn couldn't believe his words. However, the rumours that Haider reminded him of had put together the missing pieces of information in the princess's father's mind. The girl was the very heroine from the rumours of the Voltar forest. Perhaps because she had lived with the monsters for 17 years, her thinking had naturally assimilated to that of the creatures. The men could find no reasonable explanation for it. So the Chancellor asked the Duke to tell them about the strange things that must have happened when Armonia was still living on their estate. Fellborn said his domain was far from the Voltar forest, but that didn't stop monsters from occasionally invading his territory. But it was inexplicable that the creatures did not attack humans. Their purpose was only to look at the princess and then return to the forest again. According to the Duke, they didn't do anything special. However, when Armonia's father left the room to ask for help, the princess was missing. The Chancellor wondered why the monsters didn't take the girl immediately, if their only goal was her. The reason for this behavior was inexplicable. Haider told his story in response. As a child, he, like Armonia, spent a lot of time with forest creatures. We see scraps of his memories of his sister, who, as it turns out, was in awe of monsters. She convinced her brother that she communicated with them with her heart, not words, and the only thing that distinguished them was appearance. As she spent more and more time with these creatures, she began to drift away from humans. Haider was worried about her, so he spent every day with her, hoping to protect her. Assis always called the monsters friends, leading her brother to think that he could also get along with them. But as we remember, the price for such thoughts was very high. Haider gripped his head, replaying the memories in his head in horror. He couldn't accept that he hadn't realized the downside of the monsters in time and prevented the tragedy. The man could not allow a repeat of what had happened in the past, because of his naive judgment that it was possible to live in peace with monsters. He rose, resting his hands on the table and saying that it was necessary to solve the problem before it got worse. That was why the Chancellor had been so insistent on the raid. Besides, if the monsters disappeared, the power of Armonia would no longer be needed by self-serving people. Thus, Haider decided to help the Duke with the constant monster invasions of his territory. And so that Armonia could no longer mess with monsters and live with humans as before, he instructed Felborn to take the girl to the manor. Haider went to Armonia's chambers to wake her and break the important news. On the way, he pondered the fact that although his father was glad to take his princess back to the manor, it was unlikely that Armonia would follow him so easily. But the man couldn't let her go back to the forest. It was amusing to realize that the Chancellor himself had lied about his identity before, and now he was doing so. The man sincerely wanted to understand the girl, just as she tried to understand humans, but it was extremely difficult. And what was more frightening for Haider was that he might lose the one he had come to care about in the battle with the monsters. Armonia awoke on the grass to the light warm breeze and the rippling of leaves. She was enveloped in the scent of the height of summer, when nature is at its peak. A pleasant familiar voice called out to the girl. It was her dear Caris sitting beside her, watching her. Armonia stood up and looked around. She remembered exactly that she was in the imperial palace in her chambers, but the dragon reassured her, telling her that it was only a dream, and you could say that they were now speaking in her subconscious. The girl tried to pinch herself and felt no pain. A dream indeed. Caris asked Armonia about her impressions of her journey in the human world. Had it pleased her so far? But the girl's answer was clearly already different from the previous one. But she was disappointed to find that the values of those living here did not match her beliefs at all. For example, her first encounter with a mixed race of Lamia and human had shattered her expectations that he would understand both sides. Rak, however, adhered to human society. But if hybrids existed, it could mean that humans and monsters had been close before, so what was stopping them from uniting again? Caris noticed that Armonia had not thought so deeply about such things before. Then the girl told about the Kanda she had come to the capital with, and his phobia and hatred of forest creatures. The girl bowed her head regretfully, saying that no matter how hard she tried to prove to him that not all monsters were bad, he had his own reasons for not believing her. Caris said that people are always stubborn, so it's hard for them to accept someone else's point of view. And yet, despite her disgust for Hyde, Armonia sincerely wished to be friends with him. That was why she tried to understand some things, which was extremely difficult. The dragon reminded Armonia, carefully removing a fallen green leaf from her hair, that she had many friends in her home forest, so it wasn't worth the risk of trying to make new ones among unpredictable people. Armonia quietly agreed. She also told her keeper about the horrible scene she had caught in the potions factory, about the exploitation of innocent troll children, and how she had freed them. This news made Caris worried. Armonia added that she had used her blood for this purpose. The dragon huffed nervously, reminding the girl that this was extremely dangerous, and that no one should know about her abilities. She should have summoned Caris, but to him the most important thing was her safety. Nothing was more important to the dragon than this fragile girl. Armonia didn't know if she should tell Karis the whole story, for otherwise he would immediately take her into the forest. The dragon took the girl's hand gently, asking if there were any witnesses to her careless actions. But from somewhere far away came a familiar voice calling the girl by name. The intruder of the warm idyll had arrived. Armonia rose with Karis, listening to the voice. The dragon, however, put his hand on the girl's shoulder and said firmly that it no longer mattered the outcome of her goal. Now he wanted Armonia to return to the Voltar forest as soon as possible, for she was in danger. Armonia remembered her promise to the drake, so she promised that she would return to Karis as soon as she fulfilled it. There was nothing left for the drake but to agree. However, there was no time left at all. She woke up in her bed, with a frightened Haider hovering over her, calling her name. It appeared that he had been here for a long time, but Armonia still hadn't woken up. And while the Chancellor questioned the girl about her well-being, she realized that the time allotted to her on this journey was rapidly running out. Haider informed a finally awakened Armonia that a non-blood father, Duke Felborn, had arrived at the imperial palace that morning. His only purpose was a great desire to see his long-lost dear daughter. Chancellor looked happy. Apparently he liked the idea of the girl meeting her human parents very much. He confessed that he sincerely wished that if Armonia suddenly missed the warmth of humanity, she would have a place to return to. The Chancellor felt that was far better than regretting what he had done, and for that matter, it would indeed be more conscious to leave a place before losing something. Armonia agreed, but only on the condition that they redraw up the Chancellor's favourite contract, from which no one would lose anything, but would promise to keep promises on their sides. Haider agreed to listen. Then Armonia said that she knew of the finding of the long-captured drake in the imperial palace, and if she listened to Haider and met with the Duke would allow her to meet the lizard. The offer puzzled the man, but the girl assured him that she would only look at him, and if he was scared, he could hold her. Haider thought for a long time, but still agreed with some condition. She had to enter the drake's place of confinement together with the main staff of the conquerors, including him, because this place was a specially protected area. Haider also warned the girl that it was in her best interest not to reveal her abilities to others, for she could become a target for those who were eager to gain power and wealth through her abilities, like Redbin. Armonia rightly pointed out that the Chancellor was probably trying to do it himself, to which he retorted that he had already abandoned the idea. He kept the reason confidential, turning away in embarrassment to leave the chambers. The contract was concluded. Armonia went to the reception room where her father was waiting impatiently for her. Duke Felborn couldn't believe his eyes, covering his mouth with his hand and barely holding back the tears that covered his eyes. His little girl had grown up so much. The girl suggested that the meeting would be awkward, but not to that extent. The Duke expressed regret for what had happened. For 17 years after she had been captured by the monsters, it must have been difficult to adapt to the human world. Armonia realized that her parents were not to blame, for she had been displaced by other people. The girl began her part of the conversation by saying that she held no grudge against him. However, it was not hard for her at all, because she asked the monsters themselves to take to her. Ordinary people hate her, so she went to the forest to find those who really need unconditional. Her father tried to deny it, promising that things would not be the same, but Armonia was already determined that she would not go back. Getting up from her chair, the girl declared that Felborn Manor was no longer her home. Moreover, the monsters never blamed her for her problems and were always on her side. And for that reason, her home and family are now the people of Voltar Forest. Armonia's final punishment was to stay away from her, for she summons those they all hate so much, the monsters. The girl left the waiting room with a downcast look. Haider, who had heard everything, was waiting outside the door, looking sympathetically at Armonia. He asked the girl to try again, but she had had enough. The girl had fulfilled the terms of the contract, and forcing her to do something she didn't like was unethical and already against her will. She understood Haider's feelings and ideas, but she couldn't go through the trouble of conforming to them. Armonia thanked the Chancellor for the opportunity to meet her parent, but asked her not to do it again, for she no longer belonged to the Felborn family. Now it was Haider's turn to keep her promises. The chapter begins as we see Kuhn and Rusna sitting in Haider's office, and judging by the several cups of tea, they were clearly waiting for someone. And Chancellor told his cronies that Armonia wanted to see the Drake, so he needed 3 more people authorized to go in there. Kuhn immediately gave his consent, citing a large amount of free time, which was evident. Rusner also agreed to help, for he was quite curious about Armonia's purpose, and this inquisitiveness of the wizard annoyed the Chancellor, who glanced at him. Kuhn counted on his fingers those who had already agreed. There was one more person, who had just entered the office in the middle of the discussion. She was a woman with snow-white hair and eyes as bright as a clear sky. Rusner invited her to sit down, addressing her as St. Logia. Apologizing for being late, the woman took a seat, noting that she had already heard the conversation from afar, so the discussion promised to end more quickly. Haider initiated Logia into the matter, but didn't insist, assuming she had a rather busy schedule. But the girl agreed without a second thought, for it was a great chance to see the Chancellor's woman. Haider even choked on his tea at such a bold statement. A flushed Haider leaned back against the table, covering his mouth with his hand and clearing his throat, while Kuhn tried to figure out if what Logia had just said was true. The red-haired youth speculated that perhaps that was the reason Haider looked so affectionately at Armonia when she was near. But the Chancellor denied it. Logia chuckled softly, adding oil to the fire, for the fact that Haider had brought her with him and left her in the imperial palace suggested various ambiguous thoughts. Haider firmly stated that Armonia was just a co-worker. Of course, he had grown attached to her during their long journey together, which only caused more laughs from his cronies. The awkward conversation was saved by an urgent report from a guard who entered the study. It was a report from the village of Keplin, where a serious plague had broken out. It was clear from the village council representative that the cause was still unknown, and the symptoms were that the body became hard as a stone. People with the most severe symptoms were unable to move. In addition, the fossilized area would turn black, and the infected would become unusually hungry, forcing them to eat even dirt. Haider gave orders to blockade the village until the Emperor's order, and to provide the settlement with enough food. The guard left to carry out the Chancellor's orders. Rusner recalled hearing about this village earlier. He had heard furtively from a monster hunter who had come on an errand that a monster would appear in Keplin village. Haider was frightened. This creature was far more dangerous than the others. Perhaps Armonia would be able to solve this problem with her knowledge, which Kuhn suggested he do, as if voicing his thoughts. The Chancellor seconded the idea, rising to send a man after the girl. While Logia and Rusner were whispering behind them about how incredible and wonderful Armonia was, a girl's rough voice came from behind the door, urging them not to touch her. It was Armonia demanding that the Chancellor be summoned personally. She could not believe that he had called her. When the door opened and Haider's awkward face appeared from behind it, however, the girl changed before her eyes. The Chancellor even sent a ring with guards to make sure Armonia was sure it wasn't a hoax, but apparently that didn't help. Armonia asked indignantly why she had been disturbed. She blurted out that she would not come again if it was nothing, but her outrage was stopped by the Chancellor's hand, which lightly squeezed the girl's cheek, where an abrasion was visible. Haider didn't understand where Armonia could have gotten that abrasion, for it hadn't been there before today. He wondered with sweet concern how the girl could have missed it. Getting an abrasion in the forest was a common thing, but for Armonia personally, the imperial palace was a sickly, dangerous place, because it was unfamiliar. Logia opened the door ajar and called out to the couple. Smiling warmly, she invited them back in, so that Armonia could see why she had been summoned so abruptly. Rusner also promised to treat her cheek, for if it was not done quickly, the redness would remain for a long time. Armonia and Haider looked awkwardly at the people in the study. Sitting in the office, the girl looked around at those present. She didn't understand why she was here, so she immediately announced that she wasn't going to help in the raid. But that was not why she had been called here. Haider began to question the girl about the plague, which could probably be related to the monsters. The Chancellor spoke of symptoms that paralyzed people below the waist and stopped in stone. Armonia, after a little thought, continued his words, mentioning the brutal appetite of the infected, which surprised everyone sitting around him. These symptoms were a consequence of eating unripe fairy grass berries. These fruits are used to cure monsters, but if eaten unripe, these berries cause fatal poisoning. However, how these fruits got into the hands of humans if fairy grass only grows in monster habitats was a mystery. Armonia decided that this was a great chance to achieve her goal. It could work, though it was risky, but she had nothing to lose. In return for knowledge of the cure, she demanded the release of the imprisoned drake within the walls of the imperial palace. Kun jumped up from his chair at such a demand and said that it wasn't something she could just ask for, so she should have set simpler terms. But the girl was unwavering. Rusna looked peaceful as he sipped his tea and noted that one drake was enough for research purposes, and in the event that Armonia really wasn't lying and knew the cure, they could consider her claim. However, the cronies couldn't trust her so easily on her words, so they asked for some more information, even the most insignificant. Armonia was prepared for such a reaction, so she did not hesitate to report that the culprit might be fairy grass, the unripe fruit of which caused a similar effect on humans. The people in the cabinet were satisfied with this answer, but the final decision rested with the Chancellor, who, without long thinking, trusted Armonia as before. It was decided to go at once, since everyone was gathered. The company descended into a stone room full of bars, which raised many questions for the girl, but what bothered Armonia more was Logia's glare at her from the side. St. Logia was embarrassed to be noticed, but remarked that she was somewhat surprised that the rumours about Armonia's incredibly extensive knowledge of monsters were true. The girl waved away the fact that not all the information was available to her, which only pleased Logia more. Now she understood why the Chancellor valued her so much. Haider naturally heard this dialogue and turned around to call Logia out on her nonsense. The woman laughingly brushed it off as merely saying how nice Armony was. Now Haider had a new cause for irritation and worry, for now his entire entourage saw this chemical bond between him and his co-worker. Passing through the dimly lit corridors of the dungeon, Armonia is finally led to the place of confinement of the head of the Drake Squadron. Haider pointed at the lizard and explained that when he'd left it here with the cub, it kept howling incessantly, as if calling for someone, so they'd had to separate the cub and the adult into separate cages. Armonia walked over to the cage and grasped the bars, glancing at the chained lizard. He looked tired, probably because he hadn't seen his child in a long time and was killing himself every day, worrying if he was all right. The girl called out to the Drake leader, speaking to him in the language of the monsters, shocking the men behind her. Drake responded to Armonia's call, raising his head and questioning how a human could communicate with him in their language, and then the girl introduced herself, announcing that she would take him away from here. The company watching the action held their breath, amazed more and more by the minute. Rusna was curious as to why she was so eager to free the lizard, but it turned out that Armonia had kept such an amazing ability hidden from humans. The lizard didn't understand why the humans suddenly decided to help him, to which Armonia admitted that she had made a promise to the temporary leader of his pack that she would free their leader. The girl had no time to explain the details, and the monster could not trust her, but she assured him that she fully accepted his side and would help him return to the pack. Drake asked if he could leave the confinement with his child, but unfortunately that was impossible. The treaty allowed only one monster to be freed. But Armonia promised she would bring the cub soon too, so there was no reason to worry. But since that was the case, the Drake straightened up proudly and told the girl to take his child first. The pack needed a leader, but the lizard stood his ground. A child is not capable of surviving out here alone without its parent. Besides, looking at Armonia's confidence in her own abilities, she'd probably come back for him quickly too. There's nothing to object to. The girl asked if he would regret his decision, to which the Drake, lying down on the floor of his dungeon again, said that his answer would never change, for his child was everything to him. To think that the lizard was putting his child above an entire group of individuals who relied on him completely. Does becoming a parent make you act not rationally, but from your feelings? Not only monsters, but humans did the same, Armonia thought, recalling her bewildered father, unable to find a place for the joy of at least seeing his insatiable, precious daughter. Armonia exhaled, saying that the Drake would have to hold out a little longer before she came. But how could he disobey the Quanir? The girl asked in amazement what the lizard had called her. He explained that Quaniers were people with the ability to enchant and control monsters. It was the first time Armonia had heard such a name, but there was only one thing that didn't match. She couldn't control monsters as Drake had said, but the man had implied that it was far from true. It was just that the girl hadn't felt it yet. Even now, there was an unimaginable energy emanating from her that might have made the lizard believe her. Time was running out, and Armonia had to make a decision on who she would free. She kept her promise and sent for the baby Drake. Now it was Armonia's turn to fulfill her part of the bargain. She firmly declared that she would go to the forest alone to get the antidote, which puzzled Haider. In order to cure herself, she had to eat the whole of the ripe fairy herb, but it only grew where the monsters lived, so there was no choice but to send Armonia there alone. Haider and Armonia did not understand how a herb not found among human settlements had ended up in human hands. It could have been a coincidence, or it could have been someone's bloody plan. Armonia returned tiredly to her chambers and flopped down on her bed without energy. Tomorrow she had to go to the village again. She didn't know if she would be able to gather the necessary amount of herbs for the cure. But most importantly, while the girl was in town, she had no idea what to do with the baby Drake that was freely sent right into the room with her. The child did not react to Armonia's words and sat sadly in the corner, as if waiting for more torture. The girl realized that from his side she looked the same as his tormentors, so it was natural that he shunned her. Her head was bursting with thoughts. She couldn't get enough advice, just like in the good old days. Fairy and Lime, who had been waiting for her, jumped out of the closet. Lime accused the girl of lying, for she had promised to return to them and had left them all at the inn, disappearing within the walls of the imperial palace. The girl apologized sincerely, folding her palms together, but now she had moved one step closer to her goal and could deal with everything further, when suddenly an angry fairy interrupted her. Fairy announced that this was the end of Armonia's journey in the human world, and she would now have to return to the Voltar forest now.